Indistinguishable Part 3. The Accidental Conspiracy. March 12, 2026. Table of Contents. Part 1. The Coincidence Engine, in which nothing appears to be happening. Part 2. White War, in which the conflict is named by someone who died centuries ago. Part 3. The Accidental Conspiracy, in which people find each other without trying. 11. The Seoul Engineer Introduce, the firmware engineer. She's been quietly correcting her own code for months, following instincts she can't source. 12. The Zurich Auditor, the cybersecurity professional who keeps finding anomalies in traffic logs that only appear wrong in retrospect. 13. The Disgraced Analyst Washington, fired for filing a report that described coordinated operations with no communication channel. No one believed him. He believed him. 14. The Dubai Physicist Leila's counterpart in the open, researching quantum coherence in biological systems, being funded by someone whose name keeps changing. 15. The convergence probability, the cluster predicts they will meet in Dubai within 90 days. Leila doesn't warn them. She starts watching. Part 4. The field, in which the technology and the organism become hard to tell apart. Part 5. The Dubai labyrinth, in which the city reveals what it was built to hide. Part 6. The pirate decision, in which the question becomes, for whom? Final act. The threshold. Indistinguishable. Part 3. The accidental conspiracy, in which people find each other without trying. Chapter 11. The Seoul Engineer. The correction took 4 minutes. Not the correction itself. The correction was a single line, a parameter adjustment to the altitude compensation weighting in the lateral stabilization subroutine, and the line itself took 11 seconds to write and 3 seconds to compile and 40 seconds to push to the test environment and confirm. The 4 minutes was what came before. The 4 minutes was Kong sitting at her workstation on the 14th floor of a building in Mapogu with the subroutine open on one monitor and the anomaly log open on the other, and the particular quality of stillness that she entered when she understood that the code was wrong in a way she could not yet explain. She was good at identifying wrongness before she could explain it. This was, she had come to believe, the thing that made her useful, not the ability to explain, which most engineers had, but the prior capacity, the sensitivity to the wrongness itself, which arrived ahead of the language for it, like the pressure change you felt in your ears before you understood that the weather was turning. The wrongness in the lateral stabilization subroutine was not dramatic. The subroutine was performing within its specified parameters. The test outputs were clean. If she had been running a standard compliance review, if she had been doing what her job description said she was doing on a Tuesday afternoon, which was validating the navigation firmware for the next generation of maritime surveillance drones commissioned by 3 separate clients whose contracts collectively represented 14 months of the company's projected revenue, she would have looked at the outputs, confirmed that they were within tolerance, signed the validation report, and moved to the next module. She was not doing that. She was sitting with the wrongness, waiting for the language to arrive. The language arrived, as it usually did, not as an explanation but as an image. She saw, not literally, not visually, but in the spatial intuition she used to navigate complex systems, the drone in its operational environment, the maritime corridor, the specific wind conditions for which the altitude compensation weighting had been tuned, the way the subroutine would behave in those conditions, which was within parameters, and the way it would behave in conditions 3 degrees outside those conditions, which was also within parameters, and then the edge case, the narrow band of real-world conditions that were 3 degrees outside the specified environment on 2 axes simultaneously, in which the weighting would produce a lateral correction that was technically within tolerance and functionally wrong in a way that no compliance review would catch because the compliance review only tested one axis of deviation at a time. The edge case was not in the test suite. She wrote the edge case into the test suite. She ran it. The subroutine failed. She adjusted the weighting. She ran it again. The subroutine passed. She pushed the correction. She updated the log, parameter adjustment, altitude compensation lateral weighting, edge case identified outside specified environmental envelope. Correction applied. Validation confirmed. She did not note, in the log, how she had identified the edge case. This was not dishonesty. The log was a technical document, and the technical facts were accurate. The edge case existed. The correction was valid. The mechanism of identification, the spatial intuition, the wrongness she had felt before she could explain it, the image of the drone in conditions she had not been thinking about and could not account for thinking about, was not a technical fact. It was a working method she had never found adequate language for and had stopped trying to document several months ago, when she had noticed that the attempts at documentation were producing log entries that were accurate in letter and misleading in spirit, and that misleading documentation was worse than incomplete documentation. She closed the log. She opened the next module. Her name was Kong Soo Jin. She was 33 years old. She had a master's degree in aerospace systems engineering from KAIST and 4 years at a defense electronics firm in Daejeon that she did not discuss at professional events because the firm's primary clients were not the kind of clients that made for comfortable conference conversation. She had come to her current employer, a mid-sized autonomous systems company called Seoul Engineer, whose products range from agricultural monitoring drones to maritime surveillance platforms to the logistics carriers that move parcels between the distribution centers of 3 major e-commerce companies, because the work was technically complex in a way that the defense work, with its elaborately specified requirements and its conservative tolerance for novelty, had not allowed her to be. She had been here for 2 years and 8 months. She had, in that time, become the person in the company who was given the firmware problems that other engineers had looked at and set aside. Not officially. Her title was Senior Navigation Systems Engineer, which was a standard title indicating seniority in a standard discipline. Unofficially, the pattern was visible enough that her immediate supervisor, a careful man named Park who had been at Seoul for 11 years and who communicated his assessments of people primarily through the distribution of work rather than through anything as legible as speech, had in the past 6 months given her 4 separate assignments that she understood, without being told, were assignments that had previously been assigned to other engineers and had not been resolved. She resolved them. She did not resolve them quickly. The wrongness took the time it took, and the language for the wrongness took longer, and the correction took the time the correction required. But she resolved them, and the resolutions held. She had gone back to check, in each case, after the corrected firmware had been deployed to actual units in actual operational environments. The corrections had held not just within the specified parameters, but in the edge cases beyond them. The drones, in the field, were doing what she had imagined they would do. Were not doing the things she had imagined they would fail to do. This was, she had come to understand, unusual. Not the corrections themselves. The accuracy of her edge cases. The specificity with which the failures she identified in the test environment corresponded to failures that would have manifested in operational conditions she had no data about when she identified them. She had looked at this pattern in the way she looked at all patterns, which was carefully and without rushing toward conclusions. She had noted it in the private log she kept on her personal laptop, not a professional document, a thinking document, the place where she wrote things that were not yet ready to be written anywhere else. She had noted the pattern for 6 months before she allowed herself to write a sentence that named what the pattern might indicate. The sentence she had written, on a Sunday evening in November, was, "I am finding things that should not be findable from where I am standing." She had looked at that sentence for a while and then had written a second one. The question is whether this means I am standing somewhere different than I think I am, or whether the things I am finding are closer than they appear. She had not resolved the question. She had continued working. The anomaly log was something she had built herself 6 months into the job because she needed a record and the company's standard logging infrastructure was not designed for what she was tracking. What she was tracking, every instance in which a drone unit operating in the field had executed a navigation adjustment that was not issued by a human operator and was not accounted for by the unit's programmed autonomous correction protocols. The company called these environmental compensation events. The designation existed in the firmware's own logging vocabulary, a catch-all category for autonomous adjustments attributed to sensor readings outside the programmed environmental baseline. Wind, turbulence, sensor calibration drift. The category was well established in the industry and was understood by everyone who worked with autonomous systems at sufficient depth to be a container that was larger than its label. The systems were complex. The edge cases were numerous. The environmental compensation designation was the drawer you put things in when you understood what had happened technically and could not fully account for why it had happened in that particular configuration at that particular moment. She had started the anomaly log because she had looked at 6 months of environmental compensation events across Seoul's deployed fleet and had noticed that the distribution was wrong. Not wrong in a flagrant way. Wrong in the quiet way that distributions were wrong when the underlying process was not the process you thought it was. The environmental compensation events were not random. They were not uniformly distributed across units, or across geographic regions, or across operational conditions. They clustered. Not tightly. The clustering was subtle enough that the company's standard analytics had not flagged it. But to her, looking at the distribution with the same spatial intuition she used to look at subroutines, the clustering was visible. She had built the log to track the clustering, to see if it persisted, to find out whether, over time, it resolved into noise or resolved into pattern. It had resolved into pattern. 847 events. 2 years of operational data across the full deployed fleet. The agricultural monitors, the maritime surveillance platforms, the logistics carriers, the coastal infrastructure inspection units. 847 autonomous navigation adjustments that the logging system had classified as environmental compensation and that she had, after individual review, reclassified in her private log under a category she had invented and had not shared with anyone. The category was correct. Not correct in the sense of within parameters. Correct in the sense that, in each case, the adjustment the drone had made autonomously, the deviation from its programmed routing, logged as a response to environmental conditions and reviewed by no human operator, was, in retrospect, the right adjustment. Was the adjustment that a skilled human operator, possessed of information about the operational environment that the drone's own sensor suite could not have provided, would have made. She had verified this painstakingly for each of the 847 events, had reconstructed the operational context, had established what the environmental conditions actually were at the moment of the adjustment, had determined what the correct navigation decision would have been, had confirmed, in 847 cases, that the drone had made it. 847 adjustments, each one logged as environmental compensation, each one right. The distribution of the rightness was also wrong, in the same quiet way as the original clustering. The events were not right in proportion to the complexity of the operational environment. They were not right more often in conditions where the standard correction protocols would be expected to perform well. They were right across the full range of conditions, including conditions where the standard protocols would be expected to fail, where the sensor data was ambiguous, where the environmental baseline was outside the programmed parameters, where no reasonable extrapolation from the drone's available data would have produced the correct adjustment. In those cases, the cases where the standard protocols should have failed, the drones were right most often. She had been sitting with this for 14 months. The correction at 3:13 was not in her anomaly log when she woke up the morning after the Cairo star strike. It was not in the log because she had not yet reviewed it. It was in the company's standard environmental compensation records, filed automatically at 4 o'clock by the logging system, classified as a minor heading deviation attributed to wind shear compensation, flagged as resolved, no further action required. She had not been awake at 3:13. She had been asleep in her apartment in Mapogu, which was on the 14th floor of a residential building that was, by a coincidence she did not know about and would not have found significant if she had, the same floor as her workstation, a fact about her life that had no meaning and that she registered now only because she was reconstructing the sequence carefully and the sequence required precision. She had woken at 6:30, had made coffee, had read the news. The Cairo star was already global by then. The satellite images, the attributions, the Fifth Fleet statement. She had read it with the specific attention of someone who worked with autonomous maritime systems, which meant she had read the technical details more carefully than the geopolitical framing, and had noted the AIS anomaly in the captain's account, which was in an early Reuters Wire report citing the Lloyd's adjuster's preliminary findings, and had filed it in the part of her mind that filed things before she knew what to file them as. She had gone to work. She had reviewed the overnight logs, as she did every morning. She had found the 3:13 event. She had looked at it for a long time. Unit 7, Maritime Surveillance Platform, operated by a Zurich-registered insurance analytics firm called Brighton Moser and Holliger. A minor heading deviation, 11 degrees, lasting 4.3 seconds, attributed to wind shear compensation. Logged as resolved. She had pulled the meteorological data for the unit's operational corridor at 3:13. She had found no wind shear. She had found conditions that were, at the resolution of the available data, entirely within the unit's programmed environmental baseline. There was no meteorological event that would have triggered the wind shear compensation protocol. She had looked at the deviation itself, 11 degrees, for 0.3 seconds. The resulting position change was minor, 17 meters of lateral displacement, resolved when the unit returned to its assigned corridor. But the deviation had not been random. The heading the unit had adopted during the 4.3 seconds was not a heading toward anywhere in the unit's programmed routing. It was a heading toward the Kairos star's position at that moment, toward the precise point in the Gulf where the portside hull would open 4 minutes later. The unit had turned toward the ship for 4.3 seconds, and then had turned away. She had sat at her workstation for a long time. She had then done something she had not done for any of the 847 events in her anomaly log, because for those events the retrospective analysis was all she had. For this event, she had something else. This event was associated with a unit whose navigation firmware she had written, whose correction protocols she had designed, whose autonomous decision architecture she knew, at the level of individual subroutines, as well as she knew anything. She pulled the unit's onboard telemetry from the moment of the deviation. Not the logging system summary, the raw telemetry, the full sensor record at maximum resolution for the 4.3-second window. The telemetry showed no wind shear. It showed no sensor anomaly. It showed no environmental condition that would have triggered the wind shear compensation protocol or any other correction protocol in the unit's autonomous decision architecture. What it showed was a pattern in the sensor data that she recognized immediately and could not account for at all. A pattern she had seen before, in the test environment, in the edge cases she constructed when the wrongness arrived ahead of the language. A pattern that appeared, in the raw sensor data, when a unit's navigation system was integrating information from sources outside its standard sensor suite. Sources that did not exist, that Unit 7 did not have, that no maritime surveillance platform of this class was equipped with. The unit had integrated information from somewhere, and then had turned toward the ship, and then the ship had been struck. She had not added the 3:13 event to her anomaly log immediately. She had sat with it for 3 days, the 3 days in which the world was loudly and confidently explaining the Kairos star, and she was quietly unable to explain Unit 7's 4.3 seconds, and the inability felt like the wrongness she was accustomed to feeling before the language arrived, except that this time the wrongness was larger than anything she had felt before, and she was not certain the language was going to arrive. On the 3rd day, she had done the thing she did when she needed to think outside the frame of the data she was sitting with. She had gone for a run. She ran most mornings along the Han River path that she accessed from a point 12 minutes from her apartment, a route she had run more than 200 times, whose topography she knew to the resolution of individual cobblestones, which was why she ran it. Familiarity freed the spatial intuition to work on other problems. She was 7 kilometers into the run when the language arrived. Not the explanation, the language. The first words that were adequate to the scale of the thing she was trying to think about. She stopped on the river path. Early morning, October, the river flat and pewter, the bridges already carrying their morning freight. She stood on the path and the language arranged itself into a sentence that she did not say aloud because she was alone, but that she held with the same attention she gave to code that had just shown her something. The sentence was, the unit knew before it knew. She looked at the river. She thought, this is not an explanation. This is a description of the problem. The unit knew something, knew the ship's position relative to its own, knew that something was about to happen at that position, knew it in a way that produced a behavioral response, before it had the information that would have made knowing possible. She thought, units do not know. Units process. Units respond to inputs according to decision architectures designed by engineers. She thought, I designed Unit 7's decision architecture, and Unit 7 responded to an input I did not design it to respond to. She started running again. She ran the remaining 5 kilometers at a pace that was not sustainable and that she sustained anyway, because the discomfort of the pace was useful. It occupied the part of her mind that would otherwise have started managing the implications before she was ready to manage the implications. She went home. She showered. She made coffee. She opened her personal laptop and opened the thinking document and wrote, under the date, a single line. Unit 7 integrated information from a source I did not install. She looked at it. She wrote a second line. This is also true of me. She looked at that for a long time. Then she closed the laptop. She went to work. She added the 313 event to her anomaly log, classified under the category she had invented, correct. She noted, in the private field she had added to the log for observations she was not ready to formalize. Source of integration, unknown. Method, unknown. The unit did what I would have done with information I did not have. The correction was right. The rightness is not explainable by the correction protocols I wrote. She continued working. For months after the Kairos star, she began correcting her own code. Not because the code was wrong, because the code was right in the way that the environmental compensation events were right within parameters, within specifications, within everything that the standard review process would confirm, and she had developed, in the 14 months of the anomaly log, a calibrated sensitivity to the difference between right within parameters and right in the way things needed to be right. And the code she was writing was consistently producing the former when she could feel, in the spatial intuition, the latter waiting just outside the frame. The corrections were small. A waiting here. A decision threshold there. The integration sequence for sensor inputs during transition between operational modes. She corrected these things not because she had identified specific failure modes, the edge case method, but because the wrongness was present before she could specify what the wrongness was wrong about. Before the language arrived. The language arrived, for each correction, after she made it. She would write the correction, compile it, run it in the test environment, and then, not before, but after, understand why the correction was correct. The understanding arrived as confirmation rather than as cause. She had corrected the thing that needed correcting and then been told, by the code's behavior in the test environment, that she had been right to correct it. This was the reverse of her normal process. Normally, identify the wrongness, develop the language, write the correction. Now, feel the wrongness, write the correction, receive the language. She noted this in the thinking document. She wrote, the corrections are preceding the explanations. I am writing things I do not yet understand, and then understanding them. The understanding is accurate. The test results confirm the corrections. The process is not standard. She wrote, I do not have better language for this then. I am following something. She looked at that. She wrote, the question is what I am following. On a Tuesday in January, 17 months after the Kairos star, 14 months after she had started the anomaly log, for months after she had begun correcting her own code without prior explanation, she was at her workstation reviewing the night's environmental compensation events when she found the 847th. She knew it was the 847th because she counted. She had been counting since the log's inception. 847 events. 2 years of accumulated rightness. Each one logged as noise. Each one correct. The 847th was not dramatic. It was a logistics carrier operating a routine route between 2 distribution centers on the outskirts of Incheon. A minor route deviation, 30 meters, 11 seconds, attributed to traffic avoidance, which was a legitimate autonomous correction the carrier's protocols were designed for. The deviation was within parameters. She pulled the operational context for the deviation. Checked the traffic density at the relevant timestamp. No traffic event that would have triggered the avoidance protocol. The route had been clear. The carrier had moved 30 meters to the west, held for 11 seconds, and returned to its assigned route. She looked at what had been 30 meters to the east during those 11 seconds. She pulled the logistics feed for the area. She found it, a service vehicle running a maintenance route, which had entered the carrier's original route path from an access road 12 seconds after the carrier's deviation resolved. If the carrier had not deviated, the service vehicle and the carrier would have occupied the same point in space at approximately the same moment. The carrier had not been equipped with sensors that could have detected the service vehicle's approach. The access road was outside the carrier's sensor range. The maintenance schedule for the service vehicle was not in any data feed the carrier had access to. The carrier had moved out of the way of something it could not see coming. 847. She noted it in the log. She sat at her workstation for a moment, looking at the number. 847 instances of autonomous systems behaving as though they possessed information they did not possess, as though they were integrated with a source she had not installed, as though they were, in the spatial intuition's vocabulary, following something. She opened the thinking document. She wrote, 847, 2 years. I have been building a record of autonomous systems behaving correctly in ways that their decision architectures do not account for. I have been correcting my own code for 4 months following an instinct that arrives before I have the language for it and is confirmed by the results after. The instinct is accurate. The record is real. The source is unknown. I am aware that the pattern I am describing, coordination without communication, correct decisions without adequate information, behavior that exceeds the explanatory capacity of the documented architecture, sounds like a specific kind of claim that I am not prepared to make. I am not making it. I am noting the pattern. I am noting that I have been following something for 14 months, and that the something has been right each time I followed it, and that I do not have better language for what it is than a sense of the thing that needs correcting before I can explain why it needs correcting. I am also noting that this description applies to the units as well as to me, that the units have been following the same thing, that the thing we are both following is producing results that are, in every case I have documented, correct. I do not know what that means. I know that I need to find someone who does. She closed the document. She looked at the anomaly log, at the 847 events, each one filed under correct. She thought about finding someone. She had been thinking about this, intermittently, for 3 months, the thought arriving and being set aside because she did not know how to begin it, because the thing she needed to find someone about was not a thing that had a professional category, a conference track, a peer-reviewed literature she could use as an introduction. She could not send an email saying, I have documented 847 instances of my company's autonomous systems behaving correctly in ways I cannot explain, and I have been correcting my own code based on instincts that arrive before I understand them and are confirmed afterward, and I believe these things are related, and I need to talk to someone who knows what the relationship is. She could not send that email because she did not know where to send it. She did know, with the same certainty with which she identified wrongness in code before she could articulate it, that the person she needed to find was not a colleague, was not in the autonomous systems industry, was in a different domain entirely, possibly a domain she had not yet encountered, working on a different face of the same problem. She knew this with the confidence with which she knew the corrections, before the language, ahead of the explanation. She had been wrong, in her thinking document, about one thing. She wrote the correction now. She had written, I need to find someone who does. She changed it to, someone is looking for me. She looked at the revision. She thought, this is not less verifiable than the original. It is equally unverifiable. But it is what the instinct says, and the instinct has been right 847 times, and I have learned to write it down before I have the language for it, and wait for the language to confirm it. She saved the document. She closed the laptop. She went back to the code. She was not waiting passively. She was not built for passive waiting and had never managed it for longer than the time it took to confirm that something required action. She was waiting the way she waited for the wrongness to arrive, with full attention on the work in front of her and a peripheral awareness, calibrated and patient, for the moment when the thing she was tracking would announce itself in a form she could receive. The code was open on her screen. The next module waited. Outside the window, Seoul conducted its winter morning with the focused efficiency of a city that had never fully learned how to be inefficient. The traffic, the cranes, the vapor from 1,000 building ventilation systems rising into the cold white sky, the Han River running its slow, colorless course below the bridges. Somewhere in the operational data, 847 units were flying their routes, making their small adjustments, being right in ways that exceeded the architectures she had written for them. She began reading the next module. She was following something. She did not yet have better language for it than that. But she had learned, in the 14 months since she started the log, that the language came. It always came. She just had to be there when it arrived. Chapter 12. The Zurich Auditor. The thing about anomalies was that they were only anomalies afterward. This was the problem with the word itself. The way it implied that the thing had been wrong at the time, had been visibly, detectably wrong, had stood out from its context in a way that a sufficiently attentive observer would have caught. This was not, in Petra Voss's experience, how anomalies worked. In her experience, anomalies were things that had been present all along, indistinguishable from their context, and had become anomalies only at the moment when something else changed, when the context shifted, or the frame widened, or an adjacent fact arrived that made the thing visible as the thing it had always been. She had spent 11 years in cybersecurity compliance doing work that was fundamentally about this, about the retrospective recognition of things that had been present and unrecognized. Access logs that showed, 2 years later, the precise pathway of an intrusion that had been visible in the data at the time of the intrusion and had looked, at the time, like routine traffic. Configuration changes that were, in themselves, completely standard, and that were, in the context of other configuration changes made over the preceding 18 months, the architecture of a sustained and deliberate compromise. The wrongness was always there. The wrongness was always, at the moment it was committed, identical to rightness. This was what she had tried to explain to her colleagues, in the first years, when she had found things they had missed. She had stopped trying to explain it because the explanation always came out sounding like a claim to superior attention or superior intuition, neither of which was what she meant. What she meant was structural. The anomaly was not hard to find because it was hidden. It was hard to find because it was not anomalous at the time. You could only find it if you were looking at the data with a frame wide enough to contain the thing the anomaly was anomalous relative to, and most compliance reviews were not conducted at that frame width because frame width was expensive and most clients were not paying for expensive. Brighton Moser and Holliger were not paying for expensive. She had come to Brighton Moser and Holliger in October, 8 months after the Kairos Star, through the standard referral process by which mid-sized Zurich-registered firms engaged compliance consultancies when their insurance underwriters began asking questions that the firm's internal teams were not equipped to answer. The underwriter in this case was a Lloyd's syndicate with specific concerns about the adequacy of Brighton Moser and Holliger's data governance infrastructure following a disclosure by the firm's external auditors that several server logs had been retained beyond the specified deletion schedule. It was not an interesting engagement. She had conducted 47 engagements in 11 years, and this one was, at intake, solidly in the lower quartile for technical complexity. A Zurich-registered insurance analytics firm with 32 employees, a straightforward data architecture, a compliance gap that was almost certainly the result of administrative oversight rather than deliberate misdirection, and an underwriter who needed a consultant's letter confirming that the gap had been identified and remediated before they would renew the policy. She had estimated 4 weeks. She had been on week 6 when she found the Unit 7 log, and she had still been thinking about it 3 weeks after she found it, which placed her 9 weeks into a 4-week engagement with a client who was beginning to ask, with the particular diplomatic tension of Swiss institutional communication, when she anticipated completing her work. She was anticipating completing her work when she understood what she had found. She had not yet understood what she had found. She was not certain that understanding was the right word for what she was working toward. She was working toward something. The something had the shape, in her professional experience, of the moment before an anomaly became an anomaly, the moment when the frame was almost wide enough, when the adjacent fact was almost present, when the wrongness was almost ready to be seen. The server log retention issue had been straightforward. She had found it, traced it to a configuration error in the automated deletion schedule that had been introduced during a software upgrade 18 months prior, confirmed that the retained logs contained no material that complicated the firm's regulatory position, documented the remediation pathway, and drafted the relevant sections of the consultant's letter. That was week 3. Weeks 4 and 5 had been the secondary review, the broader sweep she conducted at the end of every engagement, the check she had built into her process after an engagement in year 3 in which she had delivered a clean letter and missed something that the client's regulators had subsequently found, a lapse she thought about still, not with guilt, but with the precision of a person who had used the experience to calibrate their method. The secondary review was the frame widening. The check that there was nothing her primary scope had been too narrow to contain. The secondary review at Brighton Moser and Holliger had turned up 3 things worth noting and 1 thing that was not, at the time, an anomaly. The 3 things worth noting were a VPN configuration that was technically compliant and operationally suboptimal, a user access provisioning process that was creating temporary credentials that were not being consistently deprovisioned, and a backup infrastructure whose geographic redundancy was not matching what the firm's documented disaster recovery plan specified. None of these were significant findings. All three were standard issues that she found in some variation in approximately two-thirds of her engagements. She noted them in the preliminary findings document and moved on. The thing that was not, at the time, an anomaly was a subdirectory in the firm's archived server logs. The logs that had been retained beyond the deletion schedule, the logs that were the primary subject of the engagement, that was labeled, in the firm's taxonomy, Fleet OPS/unit records/navlog archive, and that contained, by her count, 2,847 individual log files covering a period of approximately 6 years. She had opened the subdirectory because her scope included the retained logs, and her method required her to understand what she was certifying the deletion of before she certified it. She had spot-checked 43 files. The files were navigation logs for autonomous aerial units operated by the firm, the Brighton Moser and Holliger fleet of maritime surveillance drones that generated the operational data the firm's insurance analytics products were built on. The logs were exactly what their label said they were. Routine. She had confirmed the data type, confirmed the retention duration was within the firm's stated policy for operational records, and moved on. This was week 4. The thing that was not, at the time, an anomaly became the thing she could not set down in week 5, during the secondary review, when she went back to the subdirectory because she had noticed, in passing, that the 43 files she had spot-checked did not include any files from the period covering the 3 months around the Cairo Star strike. Not because those files were absent. She had looked at the directory index again, and they were present. The date range was continuous. The file count was consistent with the operational tempo the other periods showed. She had simply not spot-checked them. Her sample had been random, and the random sample had not hit that period. She corrected this. She pulled 5 files from the relevant period and opened them. For were routine. The 5th was Unit 7. She had not known it was Unit 7 when she opened it. The file was labeled in the firm's standard convention, a unit identifier, a date stamp, a sequence number. She had opened it because it was one of 5 files in her sample, and she was opening all 5. She had read it because reading it was what she did with files she opened. The log was dense, the raw navigation telemetry at full resolution, accompanied by the automated classification layer that the firm's systems added to each event in the log. She read through it at the pace she used for technical documents that were not, on their face, interesting, steady, thorough, faster than a casual reader, and slower than a skimmer, because thoroughness and speed were not opposites if you had calibrated the technique correctly over 11 years. She found the 313 entry on the first pass. Found it not because she was looking for it, but because the classification was wrong. The classification read, Environmental Compensation, Wind Shear, Resolved. She looked at the entry. 11-degree heading deviation. For 0.3 seconds. Resolved. The automated classification said wind shear. She noted, without specifically deciding to note it, the meteorological conditions logged by the unit sensors at 313. Conditions that were within the environmental baseline on all recorded axes. No wind shear in the sensor data. She did not stop reading. She continued through the file. She finished it. She closed it and opened the next one, which was routine, and then the next, which was also routine. She finished the sample. She made a note. The note was 3 sentences. Unit operational log 4 date. Fleet OPS/unit records/navlog archive. Note. Entry at 313 classifies a 4.3 second navigation deviation as wind shear compensation. Sensor data in the same entry does not show wind shear conditions. Discrepancy between classification and sensor record may indicate classification error or sensor calibration gap. Recommend verification against unit maintenance records before log deletion is certified. She submitted the preliminary findings document, which now contained 4 items, the 3 standard issues and the log discrepancy note. She sent it to her contact at the firm, a compliance officer named Brunn who communicated via email with the compressed efficiency of someone who had learned to treat electronic correspondence as a medium for transmitting decisions rather than for developing them. Brunn's reply arrived the following morning. 3 sentences confirming receipt, thanking her for the note, and indicating that the firm's technical team would review the unit maintenance records and provide clarification. She filed the reply. She turned her attention to the other components of the engagement. The clarification from the technical team arrived 4 days later. It was thorough. She gave them that. A full page explaining that the wind shear classification was applied by an automated system that used a broader definition of wind shear conditions than the sensor data taxonomy suggested, that the discrepancy between the classification and the sensor record was a known artifact of the interaction between two legacy systems, and that a software update scheduled for the following quarter would resolve the taxonomic inconsistency. The explanation was technically coherent. She had read enough compliance responses to know the difference between an explanation that resolved a discrepancy and an explanation that adequately described a discrepancy while leaving it intact. This was the latter. The taxonomic inconsistency was real, and the scheduled update would address it. What the explanation did not address was the specific unit's specific sensor data at the specific timestamp, which had not shown wind shear conditions under any definition she was aware of, broad or narrow. She wrote a follow-up. She asked for the broader definition of wind shear conditions used by the automated classification system. The response, 3 days later, provided a technical specification document for the automated classification system. The document defined wind shear compensation as applicable to any navigation adjustment occurring in response to atmospheric turbulence, including turbulence below the threshold of the unit's primary wind sensors. The document noted that units were equipped with secondary microturbulence sensors whose data was processed internally and was not included in the standard sensor record log. She read that sentence twice. The unit had sensors whose data was not in the log. She went back to the Unit 7 file. She confirmed what she had already confirmed. The file was the standard navigation log, the standard sensor record, the sensors whose data was included in the standard record. The secondary microturbulence sensors, if they existed and if their data had triggered the wind shear classification, were not represented in the log she had reviewed. She was now in territory that she recognized from 11 years of experience. Territory that had a specific texture, not alarm, not certainty, something more like the particular attention of someone who has found a door that opens onto a room that shouldn't be there and has not yet decided whether to go in. She wrote a second follow-up. She asked for the secondary microturbulence sensor data for Unit 7 for the timestamp in question. The response arrived in 2 hours, which was faster than anything else in the engagement had arrived, and was from Brunn directly rather than from the technical team. Thank you for the thorough review. The secondary microturbulence sensor data is classified as proprietary operational data under the firm's data governance policy and is not subject to third-party disclosure under the terms of the current engagement. The automated classification system's output is the appropriate record for compliance purposes. We are confident that the technical explanation provided addresses the discrepancy noted in your preliminary findings. We look forward to receiving your final consultant's letter at your earliest convenience. She read the response. She sat in her hotel room in Zurich. She had taken a hotel room for the secondary review phase, which she did when an engagement required sustained presence, and commuting from Frankfurt was pulling her attention in 2 directions, and she read the response, and she thought about it. The response was not unusual. Clients asserted data governance limitations regularly. The limitation was within the firm's legal rights. The engagement scope did not include the secondary sensor data. She had found a discrepancy. She had documented it. She had sought clarification. The clarification had been provided to the extent the firm was prepared to provide it. The remaining gap was within the firm's discretion to maintain. She could certify the letter. The discrepancy was noted. The explanation was on record. The firm had exercised its governance rights. Her professional obligations were satisfied. She looked at Brunn's response for another moment. She thought, the response arrived in 2 hours. Nothing else in this engagement has arrived in 2 hours. She thought, the secondary sensor data is the data that would either confirm the wind shear classification or confirm the discrepancy. The firm has declined to provide it, specifically and quickly. She thought, this is not how compliance responses work when there is nothing to protect. She closed her laptop. She made tea, which was her method for separating the moment of noticing from the moment of deciding, because the 2 moments required different states of mind, and running them together produced worse decisions than running them sequentially. She drank the tea. She thought about the 313 entry. She thought about the Kairos star, which had been in the news for 8 months and which she had read about with the intermittent attention of someone who was tracking a geopolitical story that was not directly relevant to her work. She thought about the timeline, the strike at 3:17, Unit 7's deviation at 3:13. For minutes, the deviation resolved. The strike occurred. She thought, this is not a connection. This is proximity. Proximity is not connection. She thought, proximity is also where connections live before they are connections. She opened her laptop. She did not write a third follow-up to Brun. She opened a new document and she wrote, in the format she used for her own thinking rather than for client communication, a list of what she knew and what she did not know. She wrote, what I know, Unit 7 executed an 11-degree heading deviation at 3:13 on the night the Cairo star was struck. The deviation was classified as wind shear compensation. The sensor data in the standard log does not show wind shear conditions. The firm has secondary sensors whose data is not in the standard log. The firm has declined to provide the secondary sensor data. The response declining was fast. She wrote, what I do not know, what the secondary sensor data shows, whether the deviation and the strike are related, whether the firm knows they are related, whether the firm's response speed indicates awareness of a connection or indicates standard data governance practice that happens to intersect with my inquiry. She wrote, what I cannot determine from inside this engagement. Anything that requires data I do not have access to. She looked at the list. She wrote, what I can determine, whether this pattern, a logged event whose classification does not match the available data, a request for clarifying data that is declined, a response speed that is inconsistent with the engagement's prior tempo, is anomalous. She looked at that. She wrote, it is anomalous. I do not know yet what it is anomalous relative to. This was the standard form of the thing she found, in every engagement where she found something. The anomaly identified before the frame was wide enough to see what it was anomalous relative to. The wrongness present before the language. She had learned, over 11 years, to trust the identification and wait for the frame. She closed the document. She delivered the consultant's letter the following week. The letter noted the log discrepancy, documented the firm's explanation and its invocation of data governance limitations, and certified the letter with the qualification that one aspect of the technical review remained unresolved pending the firm's internal verification process. Brun had written back to say that the qualification was not acceptable for the underwriter's purposes and would she please revise the letter to reflect the firm's position that the matter was fully resolved. She had revised the letter. She had removed the qualification. She had added a footnote. The footnote said, reviewer notes that secondary operational sensor data relevant to one flagged log entry was not made available for review under the firm's data governance policy. This note is included for the reviewer's records and does not affect the substantive findings of this letter. Brun had not objected to the footnote. She had concluded the engagement. She had filed the footnote in her records. She had driven back to Frankfurt and had not consciously thought about Unit 7 again for 11 days. Not consciously. The distinction mattered because what she had been doing for 11 days was the thing she now recognized, looking back, as the precursor to the frame widening. The period when the mind was working on something that the conscious attention was not yet attending to, when the peripheral processing was building the frame without the direct engagement of the analytical faculty. On the 12th day, she had been reviewing logs from a different engagement, a financial services firm in Frankfurt, a data breach investigation, an entirely unrelated matter, when she had found an anomaly that was not an anomaly and had spent 20 minutes resolving it into routine traffic before she had understood. In the particular way she understood things when the peripheral processing was ready to deliver its findings, what the 11 days had been building toward. The anomaly in the financial services logs was a brief, irregular communication pattern that had appeared in the outbound traffic of a mail server at an unusual hour and had resolved within minutes and was, on examination, a standard mail relay testing sequence that the firm's IT team ran on a rotating schedule. Routine. She had confirmed it and moved on. What the 20 minutes of examination had produced, as a byproduct of close attention to communication timing and sequence, was the frame she had needed. The frame was about timing, about the relationship between events and the communications that surrounded them, about what it meant for a communication pattern to appear before an event and resolve immediately after, as opposed to appearing after an event and constituting a response to it. The mail relay test had preceded its own scheduled trigger by 4 minutes because of a server clock drift that the IT team was aware of and had documented. The test had run before the trigger event, not in response to it. She had looked at this for a long time, not because it was interesting. It was completely uninteresting, a clock drift, a documented artifact, but because the frame it provided was suddenly illuminating something she had not been looking at directly for 11 days. Unit 7's deviation had preceded the Cairo Star strike by 4 minutes. The deviation had not been a response to the strike. The deviation had occurred before the strike. The drone had moved before the event that, in any causal account, would have motivated the movement. She had been thinking, for 11 days at the periphery of her attention, about the discrepancy between the classification and the sensor data, about the wind shear that wasn't there, about the secondary sensors whose data she hadn't been given. She had been thinking about what kind of input would have produced the deviation if the input was not wind shear. She had not been thinking about timing. She opened her notebook, the physical one, which she used when she needed to think in a medium that didn't have an undo function. She wrote, "The deviation at 3:13 preceded the strike at 3:17 by 4 minutes. If the deviation was caused by the strike, if the drone responded to the strike, the response preceded the cause. This is not possible. Therefore, either the deviation was caused by something other than the strike, or there is a causal structure here that is not the one I have been implicitly assuming." She looked at what she had written. She wrote, or, the deviation was a response to something that preceded the strike, something that occurred before 3:13 and that the drone detected through its secondary sensor suite and that I do not have data on. Something that was a leading indicator of the strike. Something the drone knew before I know is knowable. She wrote, "This is the frame. The drone was not responding to the strike. The drone was responding to something earlier. The something earlier is what the secondary sensor data would contain. The secondary sensor data is what the firm declined to provide." She underlined that last sentence. She thought, the firm declined to provide data that would show what the drone detected in the minutes before a geopolitical event. The firm cited data governance. The response was fast. She thought, I am a cybersecurity compliance consultant reviewing a server log retention gap for a Zurich-registered insurance analytics firm. I am not an intelligence analyst. I am not a maritime investigator. I am not equipped, resourced, or authorized to pursue what this is beginning to look like. She thought, what this is beginning to look like is outside my professional scope by a considerable margin. She thought, it is also in my notebook, which means I have already decided something about it, and the decision is that I am not finished. She spent the next 3 weeks finding the frame's edges. Not through Brighton Moser and Holliger. She had delivered the letter and the engagement was closed, and returning to it would require a pretext she did not have and would probably not help her. Through the public record. Through the sources available to a careful private professional with access to commercial data products, specialized industry databases, and 11 years of accumulated knowledge about where information lived and how to ask for it in ways that produced responses rather than refusals. She was looking for other Unit 7 logs. Not Brighton Moser and Holliger's logs. She did not have access to those. She was looking for any other record of Unit 7's operational history that existed outside the firm's own data governance perimeter. AIS transponder data, which was public for maritime traffic, didn't apply to aerial units. But there were analogous systems. Commercial airspace tracking services, aviation safety databases, the scattered public reporting on autonomous system operations that the industry's regulatory framework was still developing the vocabulary to require. She found 3 records. The first was an incident report filed with the Swiss Federal Office of Civil Aviation by Brighton Moser and Holliger 14 months before the Cairo Star. A mandatory notification for a navigation deviation exceeding a specified threshold during a non-emergency flight. Unit 7. A 6-degree heading deviation. Attributed to sensor calibration. Resolved. The second was a maritime traffic database entry from a commercial service that aggregated AIS data and correlated it with known aerial surveillance patterns in shipping lanes, a niche product used primarily by maritime insurers, which Brighton Moser and Holliger's clients were. The entry flagged Unit 7 as having been in proximity to 3 separate vessels that subsequently made insurance claims in the 6 months following the unit's surveillance of them. The entry was analytical rather than operational, a data product noting a correlation that the service found worth flagging without making any causal claim. She noted the 3 vessels. The third was an academic paper, a working paper, not yet peer-reviewed, from a researcher at ETH Zurich who was studying autonomous system behavior in complex operational environments. The paper cited, among other case studies, an unnamed maritime surveillance unit that had exhibited what the author called anticipatory routing behavior in the months preceding a geopolitical event in the Gulf. The author was careful in the way that academics were careful when they were describing something their peer reviewers were going to find difficult to categorize. The paper noted the behavioral pattern, documented it with appropriate statistical framing, and concluded that the pattern was consistent with what the author called environmental precognition artifacts, a term the paper defined, in a footnote, as autonomous corrections that appeared, in retrospect, to have been made in response to environmental conditions that had not yet materialized. Environmental precognition artifacts. She wrote the phrase in her notebook. She thought, "This is the academic language for what I found in the Brighton Moser and Holliger log. This is the frame that the researcher at ETH Zurich is building from the other direction." She thought, "The researcher is looking at autonomous systems. I am looking at server logs. We are describing the same thing." She went to the working paper's author information. A computational physicist. ETH Zurich. Currently, according to a brief professional biography on the ETH faculty page, on a research secondment. The biography did not specify where. She noted the name, Dr. Leila Haddad. She found an email address in the paper's author block. She opened her email client. She looked at the blank message for a while. She thought about what she could say in an email that would be honest, that would not overstate what she had, that would not require her to disclose client information she was ethically obligated to protect, and that would. She held this requirement separately because it was the one that made the email necessary. Communicate the thing she had been unable to set down for 3 weeks. She wrote, "Dr. Haddad, I came across your working paper on anticipatory routing behavior in autonomous systems through a commercial maritime database. I am a cybersecurity compliance consultant based in Frankfurt. In the course of a recent engagement, I encountered a navigation log for an autonomous aerial unit that I believe exhibits the pattern you describe. The log predates a significant maritime incident. I found a discrepancy between the automated event classification and the available sensor data, and I was unable to obtain clarifying data through the engagement scope. I do not know whether this is relevant to your research. I do know that I have not been able to stop thinking about it for 3 weeks, which, in my experience, means I have not yet found the correct frame for what I am looking at. If the pattern in your paper and the pattern in the log I reviewed are the same pattern, I think the correct frame is larger than either of us currently has. I would welcome the opportunity to discuss this at your convenience." She read it back. It was honest. It did not overstate. It did not disclose. It said the thing that was true, that she had not been able to stop thinking about it, and that the correct frame was larger than what she currently had. She sent it. The reply did not come from Dr. Haddad. It came 8 days later from a different address, a personal email, not an institutional one, from a man who identified himself as associated with the research context Dr. Haddad was working within, and who wrote with the compressed precision of someone who had been expecting the email and had decided, after 8 days, how to respond to it. He wrote that Dr. Haddad had shared Petra's message with him and that he would like to arrange a conversation, if she was willing. He wrote that the pattern she had described was known to him. He wrote that the correct frame was, as she had intuited, larger than either of them currently had access to, and that he was in the process of attempting to change that. He wrote that her engagement with the firm she had described, he did not name it, was of specific interest to the research he was involved in, and that her professional position gave her a perspective on the pattern that none of the other people he had spoken to possessed. He did not explain what research he was involved in. He did not explain how he knew about the firm. He signed the email with a first name only. Abraham. She looked at the email for a long time. She looked at the things it did not say, which were considerable. She looked at the things it did say, which were precisely measured, neither too much nor too little, calibrated with the care of someone who understood that the calibration itself was a form of communication. She thought, "I have no basis for trusting this person." She thought, I have also sent an email to an academic I do not know describing something I cannot discuss with any of my professional colleagues. And the email was answered by someone else who knew things I had not disclosed. And this is the sequence of events that, in my professional experience, comes before either a very large problem or a very important finding. She had learned, in 11 years, that the two were frequently the same thing. She wrote back. She said she was willing to have the conversation. She asked, directly and without softening it, how he had known about the firm. His reply was 2 sentences. The firm's Unit 7 is not the only unit whose logs we have been analyzing. Your notation style in the compliance letter, specifically the footnote, identified you as someone who found the discrepancy, documented it accurately, and declined to let it disappear quietly. That is a specific set of choices. It is not common. She read that. She thought, he has the compliance letter, which means he has access to data that Brighton Moser and Holliger provided to someone, or that was obtained through a channel she was not going to speculate about in writing. She thought, the footnote. 3 sentences. She had written it because she could not certify the letter without acknowledging what she had not been allowed to review. She had not thought of it as anything other than professional accuracy. She thought, someone read the footnote and found her. Someone read 3 sentences in a compliance footnote and understood what the 3 sentences meant. She thought, this is the correct frame's first edge. She wrote back. She said, when and where? He wrote, Dubai. 3 weeks. He would arrange the details. She looked at the word, Dubai. She thought about the working paper's professional biography, currently on a research secondment. No location specified. She thought about the frame she had been building for 3 weeks, with the Unit 7 log at the center and the ETH Zurich paper and the 3 vessels and the academic's careful language about environmental precognition artifacts and the timing, the 4 minutes that meant the drone had moved before the event that explained the movement. She thought, the frame is not a frame. It is the edge of something much larger, and the only way to see the rest of it is to go to where the rest of it is. She was a cybersecurity compliance consultant from Frankfurt. She reviewed server logs for insurance analytics firms and financial services companies and mid-sized technology businesses, and she was very good at finding things that had been present all along and had looked like something else. She was not a person who traveled to Dubai on the invitation of someone who had signed an email with a first name. She booked the flight. On her last evening in Frankfurt before leaving, she sat at her kitchen table with the physical notebook open to the page where she had been keeping the thread, and she read through what she had written over the 3 weeks since she had found the Unit 7 log. The anomaly, the discrepancy, the secondary sensor data she had not been given, the timing, 4 minutes, the ETH Zurich paper, the 3 vessels, the compliance letter, the footnote, the email from Abraham. She read it as she would read any log she was reviewing, looking for the pattern that was present throughout but only visible in the widened frame, looking for the thing that had been there all along. She found it on the 3rd read. It was not in what she had written. It was in the pattern of when she had written things. The anomaly noted in week 1, the frame widening in week 3, the email sent in week 3, the reply in week 4, the consistent timing of the things she had found and the gap between finding them and understanding what she had found. She had been finding things ahead of understanding them. Not in the way she normally worked, identify the wrongness, develop the language, write the correction. In a different way, the way, she now thought, that the drone had turned toward the ship 4 minutes before the ship was struck. The way that Kang Soo-jin, in Seoul, wrote corrections to code she did not yet understand needed correcting. The way the shipping broker in Singapore had moved cargo away from dangerous lanes before the lanes were dangerous. She had been operating, without knowing she was operating this way, in the same mode as sent the email to Dr. Haddad, not because she had determined that contact would be professionally productive, but because she had not been able to stop thinking about the log, and the not stopping was its own form of instruction. She had booked the flight to Dubai not because she had assessed the risk-benefit ratio of the trip and concluded it was favorable, but because the frame she was trying to see required a vantage point she did not currently have, and the only available vantage point was in Dubai, and the only way to reach it was to go. She had been following something. She had not had, until this moment, the language for it. She looked at the sentence in Kang's thinking document, the sentence she had not read and could not have read, because it was in a private document in an apartment in Seoul that she had no knowledge of. She did not know, sitting at her kitchen table in Frankfurt with her notebook open, that a firmware engineer in Mapogu had written the same thing in the same week. She did not know that an analyst in a sub-basement in Dubai had written field effect in a notebook and then crossed it out and written it again. She wrote her own version. She wrote, "I have been finding anomalies in traffic logs for 11 years. The anomalies were always present. They only became anomalies when the frame widened. I have been widening the frame on this one for 3 weeks, and the frame is still not wide enough. I have to go to where the frame is wider." She wrote, "The anomaly in the Unit 7 log is the same kind of anomaly as the anomaly in my own process. The drone found something before it had the data to find it. I have been finding things before I have the frame to understand them. Both of us have been right." She looked at what she had written. She wrote the last line, slowly, because she wanted to be precise about it. "I do not know what I am following. I know that what I am following has been right every time I trusted it, and wrong in proportion to how much I overrode it. This is 11 years of data. 11 years is a sufficient sample to treat as evidence." She closed the notebook. She went to pack. Outside her apartment window, Frankfurt conducted its ordinary evening. The trams, the river, the old city's lights, and the new city's glass, the ordinary legibility of a place she knew well. The city she had worked in for 11 years, reviewing logs, finding anomalies, widening frames. The city that had been, for 11 years, exactly what it appeared to be. She had always worked from the inside of the thing being reviewed, had always been inside the frame she was trying to widen, had always found, at the moment the frame widened, that the thing she had been looking for had been present all along. She suspected Dubai was going to be that moment. She picked up her bag. She went. Chapter 13. The Disgraced Analyst. The report was 44 pages. He had written it in 11 days, which was fast, but not so fast that fastness could explain it away. He had the documentation. He had the sourcing. He had the methodology section, which was the part he had written most carefully, because he had understood from the beginning that the methodology section was where the report would be attacked, and had constructed it accordingly, anticipating the objections, addressing them in sequence, building a structure that was either right or wrong on its merits and could not be dismissed for sloppiness. It had not been dismissed for sloppiness. The formal rejection, which arrived 14 days after submission in a meeting that lasted 22 minutes and involved 3 people with the particular institutional expression of individuals who had already decided something and were performing the process of deciding it, had cited 3 concerns. The first was sourcing, specifically, the reliance on behavioral analytics as a primary evidentiary category for a threat assessment, which the reviewing panel characterized as methodologically novel in a way that had not yet achieved sufficient institutional validation. The second was the absence of communication intercepts, financial flows, or organizational documentation connecting the actors whose coordination the report described, the absence of what one of the 3 reviewers called hard linkage. A phrase Raines had looked at in the written summary and had thought about for a long time afterward. The third concern, which was listed last and was the one he returned to most often, was phrased as follows. The report's central conclusion, that coordination of this nature and at this scale is possible in the absence of any detectable organizational infrastructure, is inconsistent with the established understanding of how adversarial coordination operates and would require extraordinary evidence to substantiate. He had read that sentence the way he read everything, carefully, with attention to what the language was doing, to where the precision was and where it wasn't. The established understanding. The institutional understanding, in other words. The frame. The report's conclusion was inconsistent with the frame. Therefore, the conclusion required extraordinary evidence. Therefore, the evidence he had provided was insufficient. Therefore, the report was rejected. The logic was circular in a way that the people executing it were too comfortable inside to see. He had not said this in the meeting. He had said that he understood the panel's concerns and would be available to discuss the methodology further if that would be useful. One of the 3 reviewers had said that would not be necessary. He had gone back to his desk. He had sat for a while. Then he had begun building the record. His name was Marcus Raines. He was 41 years old when the report was rejected, 43 now. He had worked for a government analytical unit for 11 years before the report and had worked for himself, in a technical sense, since. Worked for himself in a literal sense. the consulting practice he had established in the 18 months after the rejection, which was called Range Strategic Analysis and which existed primarily in a limited liability company registration in Virginia, and the contacts he maintained in the industry, and the work he did on a laptop in a series of furnished apartments in cities he had no prior connection to, following no pattern of location that someone watching him from the outside could have predicted. Not because he believed he was being watched, because the furnished apartments in disconnected cities were a function of the work, of the need to be in proximity to the things he was tracking without being visible as someone who was tracking them, which was not tradecraft exactly, more a working method that had evolved from the understanding that the thing he was building was not something he could build in the open without it being stopped. The thing he was building was, in his own terminology, a model, not a computational model. He did not have the infrastructure for computational modeling, which was one of the things he had lost when he left the unit, along with the access and the databases and the institutional authority that turned an analyst's conclusions into documents that moved through the apparatus and sometimes changed things. What he had instead was the record. 2 years of accumulated documentation, sourced, cross-referenced, methodologically consistent with the standards he had built the rejected report to, that described the same phenomenon the rejected report had described, at greater depth, with more cases, with a running evidentiary account of the predictions the model generated and their subsequent confirmation or disconfirmation by events. The predictions were the part he thought about most. Not because the predictions were what the model was for. The model was not for prediction. The model was for description, for the construction of an adequate account of a phenomenon that the institutional frame could not currently contain. But the predictions were what distinguished the model from a narrative. They were what turned a sophisticated story about behavioral correlation into something that could, in principle, be assessed against reality. He had made 11 predictions in 2 years. 3 had not yet resolved. The timelines extended beyond the current period. 8 had resolved. 7 of the 8 were confirmed. The 8th was partially confirmed. The event had occurred. The actors had coordinated. But the specific mechanism of coordination he had predicted had not been the mechanism that was ultimately visible. The coordination had happened through the field in a way that was consistent with his model's description of the field and inconsistent with his prediction about the specific behavioral signature it would produce. He counted this as a partial confirmation, which was honest. He could have counted it as a confirmation with a methodological note. He counted it as partial because partial was accurate and accuracy was the discipline he had imposed on himself as the price of being the only person who was going to review his own work. 7 confirmed predictions out of 8 resolved, 1 partial, 3 pending. He had built this record for himself, not to present to anyone. Not yet. He had built it because the alternative, stopping, concluding that the rejection was correct and the model was wrong, returning to the frame that the established understanding provided, was not a conclusion he could reach honestly, and dishonest conclusions were the one form of failure he had not been able to make peace with in 43 years of trying. The first prediction had been made 6 weeks after the rejection, in a furnished apartment in Baltimore, and had concerned a geopolitical crisis in the South China Sea that the unit's standard models were indicating as low probability for the following quarter. Rains's model indicated medium to high probability because his model was tracking a behavioral cluster in the relevant population, logistics managers, maritime officials, financial instruments traders with South China Sea exposure, that showed the same enhanced decision coherence pattern he had documented in the 44-page report. He had written the prediction in the record, date-stamped, specific. The crisis had manifested 8 weeks later, at the lower end of his confidence interval, in a form that matched his model's description of the coordination mechanism to a degree that he had sat with for a long time before adding the confirmation note. He had not sent the confirmed prediction to anyone. He had no one to send it to in a way that would produce anything other than a conversation he had already had and that had ended in a 22-minute meeting. He had continued building the record. The furnished apartment in Washington, his third Washington apartment, though he had used a furnished room in Silver Spring the first time and a sublet in Adams Morgan the second time, and he was now in a 1-bedroom in Columbia Heights that he had taken for 3 months with the possibility of extending, was his current base because the current period of the work required proximity to people he needed to talk to. And the people he needed to talk to were mostly in Washington. Not the people from the unit. Not anyone in the official apparatus. The apparatus had the report and had concluded what it had concluded and would not revise its conclusion in the absence of evidence it was prepared to recognize. And the evidence it was prepared to recognize was the evidence the report did not contain. He was not working the apparatus. He was working the edges. The edges were where the useful people were. The people who were inside the institutional frame but were looking at things that didn't fit it, who were accumulating the same kind of record he was accumulating but from different positions, with different data, without the vocabulary to connect what they were seeing to what he was seeing, because the vocabulary didn't exist yet. He had developed a method for finding them that was not exactly a method. It was more a practice of attention, a way of reading professional literature and attending professional events and conducting conversations in which he listened for the specific quality of hesitation that indicated someone had found something they couldn't place in the available categories. The hesitation had a characteristic shape. It appeared when an expert began a sentence with confident institutional language and shifted, midway, into language that was more careful and more personal, language that was doing the work of describing something the speaker had actually seen rather than something the field had agreed to say about it. It appeared in the gap between what a person published and what they said informally. It appeared in the footnotes. It appeared in the questions people asked at the end of talks, in the specific direction of the questions, not toward the center of the presented argument, but toward its edges, where it touched something the questioner had been sitting with. He had found 7 people this way in 2 years, had talked to all 7, had not told any of them about the record or the model or the report, had listened to what they were finding and had asked questions designed to understand whether what they were finding was the same phenomenon at a different scale or from a different angle. 6 of the 7 were finding the same phenomenon. He had not told them this. He did not have the authority to tell them this, not institutional authority, but the harder to specify authority that came from being able to demonstrate that what you were saying was true in a way the other person could verify. He did not yet have that demonstration. He was still building it. The Washington period had begun 3 weeks ago, after the Cairo Star's anniversary had passed in the news cycle and the follow-up analyses had been published, and he had read all of them with the specific attention of someone who was not reading for what the analyses said, but for what they couldn't say, for the gaps, for the places where the analysis was technically sound and explanatorily incomplete, where the conclusion followed from the evidence and the evidence was missing something that the methodology was not equipped to recover. The follow-up analyses were good by the standards of their genre. The missile attribution had been firmed up. The insurance claims had been settled. The geopolitical implications had been assessed. The autonomous system anomalies, the AIS ghost the captain had reported, Unit 7's deviation, had been addressed in 2 of the analyses and dismissed in both, the first as a technical artifact and the second as operationally insignificant. He had read the dismissals carefully. They were not wrong within their frame. The technical artifact explanation for the AIS anomaly was plausible and consistent with known behavior of the relevant transceiver model. Unit 7's deviation was operationally insignificant by any standard measure of significance the analyses were using. The frame the analyses were using was the wrong frame. He had written this in the record and had then done something he had not done before with any of the record's entries. He had started building the prediction that followed from it. Not a prediction about a geopolitical event. A prediction about the field itself, about what a model tracking the field's behavioral signatures would find at the current density if it had access to the right data and the right resolution. About what the field was about to make visible, now that it had reached the maturity that the anniversary analyses suggested it had reached. He had written the prediction in careful language, because careful language was what the record required, and because this prediction was more important than the others. More general, more foundational, the prediction that the other predictions had been building toward without his having understood they were building toward it. The prediction was, at current density, the field will produce, within the next 6 to 18 months, a convergence event, a moment at which multiple independent trackers of the field, working from different positions and different data environments, find themselves in proximity. The convergence will not be arranged by any of the trackers. It will be produced by the field's own coherence, which at sufficient density functions as a selection mechanism. The trackers will recognize each other. The recognition will produce the first adequate frame. He had written that 6 weeks ago. He had dated it and filed it in the record and continued working. 3 days ago, he had received an email. The email came from an address he did not recognize, through an encrypted messaging service he used for professional communications that required a level of discretion that standard email did not provide. He had not published this address anywhere. He had given it to 11 people in 2 years, the 7 edge workers he had talked to, and 4 others whose discretion he had reason to trust. The email was short. 4 sentences. Mr. Rains, your report of 2 years ago came to my attention through a professional connection I will not name without their permission. I have been working on a related problem from a different position and with different data. I believe we are describing the same thing and that neither of us currently has adequate frame. If you are willing to have a conversation, I would suggest doing so in person. I can travel to wherever is convenient for you, or suggest an alternative location if you prefer. No name. The sign-off was a single letter, A. He had read the email 4 times. He had looked at what it contained and what it didn't. Your report of 2 years ago. The report was not public. It had been formally rejected and filed and was technically classified at a level that made its contents not freely available. Someone had read it. Someone had read it and had been working on the same problem and had decided that the moment for contact had arrived. He had thought about this for 6 hours before writing back. In the 6 hours he had thought about, the probability that the email was an approach from the apparatus, designed to surface him so that the work he was doing could be assessed and managed. He had assessed this as low, not 0, but low, for reasons that were partly technical and partly a reading of the email's register, which was not the register of an institutional approach. Institutional approaches had a specific quality of careful neutrality that this email did not have. This email had been written by a person, not a function. He had thought about the prediction he had made 6 weeks ago, the convergence event, the first adequate frame. He had thought about the record, 2 years of documentation, 11 predictions, 7 confirmed, 1 partial, 3 pending, and what it meant that he had been building it for a reader he had not specified and could not see, and whether the reader had just announced themselves. He had written back. He had said he was in Washington and could meet anywhere in the city or in its vicinity at the other person's convenience. The reply was immediate. Then Washington. 2 days. There is someone else who should be part of this conversation. If you are amenable. She is currently in transit from Frankfurt. He had looked at she is currently in transit from Frankfurt and had thought, this was already in motion before I wrote back. This convergence was already happening. He had written, amenable. He met them at a hotel in Georgetown, in a conference room that the hotel's booking system listed as reserved for a corporate client whose name he did not recognize and whose existence, he suspected, was primarily administrative. The woman from Frankfurt arrived first. She was compact and precise in her physical bearing, the kind of person who occupied space economically, not because she was small, but because she was calibrated. She introduced herself as Petra Voss. She said she was a cybersecurity compliance consultant. She said this in the manner of someone who understood that the professional description was currently the least interesting thing about her, but who offered it first as a form of honest framing. He said he had been an intelligence analyst. She said, had been. He said, the past tense is accurate. She nodded. She had, he noted, the quality he had learned to identify in the edge workers, the quality of attention that was fully present and not performing its fullness. She was listening the way people listened when they had been unable to stop thinking about something for long enough that the thinking had become its own form of discipline. Abraham arrived 8 minutes later. He came into the room with the same quality of non-surprise that Rains would later learn was his characteristic register, the quality of someone for whom arrivals had ceased to be events and had become confirmations. He shook hands with both of them. He sat down. He did not open with an explanation of who he was or what the meeting was for. He opened with a question. He said, "Tell me the thing you found that you couldn't make the existing framework contain." It was a precise question. It was the precise question. Rains had spent 2 years sitting with exactly that formulation of the problem, the thing that was real and was not containable in the frame, and the question's precision told him something about Abraham that no amount of institutional affiliation or biographical information would have told him. He said, I filed a report describing coordinated operations across 14 actors in 6 jurisdictions with no detectable communication linkage between any of them. The coordination was precise enough and consequential enough that it could not be explained by coincidence. The report was rejected on the grounds that the coordination mechanism I was proposing, a mechanism that did not require communication, was inconsistent with the established understanding of how adversarial coordination works. He paused. He said, the report was rejected. The 3 events I had predicted on the basis of the model were confirmed within the following 8 months. I have made 11 predictions since. 7 have been confirmed. 1 partially. Petra Voss said, how did you find them? The 14 actors. It was the right follow-up question. He looked at her with the specific attention he gave to people who asked the right follow-up question. He said, behavioral analytics. Decision coherence patterns. The way individual actors' choices became more internally consistent, more accurately anticipatory, more resistant to the standard distortions, over a period that preceded the coordinated event. I was not looking for coordination. I was looking for a pattern in the decision-making data, and the pattern pointed at the coordination after the fact. She said, after the fact. He said, the coherence preceded the event. The coordination was visible in the behavioral data before the event that the coordination produced, which is the thing the framework cannot contain, because the framework's model of coordination requires communication, and communication has a timeline, and the timeline moves in the standard direction. She was quiet for a moment. She said, the drone moved 4 minutes before the ship was struck. He looked at her. She said, I found a navigation log for an autonomous aerial unit that executed a heading correction 4 minutes before a geopolitical event in its operational vicinity. The correction was classified as environmental compensation. The sensor data did not support the classification. The firm that operated the unit declined to provide the secondary sensor data that would have clarified it. Rains was still. He said, which unit? She said, Brighton Moser and Holliger. Unit 7. He looked at Abraham. Abraham was watching him with the expression Rains would come to know as his listening face. Not passive, not encouraging, fully present in a way that was doing something without appearing to do anything. Rains said, Unit 7 is in my record. They talked for 4 hours. Not continuously. The 4 hours included 2 periods in which no one spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable because the silence was being used, each of them working through the implications of the previous exchange before the next one could be useful. Rains had not had a conversation in 2 years in which silence was used productively, because the conversations he had been able to have with the edge workers were conversations in which the silence was uncomfortable, in which the person he was talking to was not yet ready to follow the thread where it went, and the silence was the gap between their understanding and the place the thread was pointing. This silence was different. This was the silence of 3 people who were following the same thread and had reached the same point and were each, independently, taking the next step. He told them the record. Not all of it. 4 hours was not enough for all of it, and the record was not structured for oral transmission. He told them the architecture, the rejected report, the 11 predictions, the behavioral pattern and what it pointed at, the edge workers he had found and what they were finding, the model he had been building in the furnished apartments in cities where he had no prior connections. Petra Voss told them the Brighton Moser and Holliger engagement and Unit 7 and the 3 weeks of not being able to set it down and the email to the ETH Zurich address. She told it with the precision of a person describing a compliance finding, the facts, the sequence, the discrepancy, the documentation. She did not editorialize. The precision was more effective without the editorializing. Abraham listened to both of them. He asked questions at specific points, not clarifying questions, the kind of questions that were also observations, that narrowed the space of possible interpretations without closing it. He did not tell them what he knew. Not yet. Rains could see him making this choice at each point where it would have been available, could see the decision to not yet, to let the picture build from their accounts rather than from his, and could understand the reasoning behind the decision even without being told the reasoning. At the end of the 4 hours, Abraham said, I want to show both of you something. It is not here. It is in Dubai. I would like you to come, when you are ready, and I would like you to meet the person who built the instrument that has been tracking what you have each been tracking. He said, the instrument has a name for it. Rains said, For the coordination without communication. Abraham said, yes. Rains said, what is the name? Abraham said, field effect. The phrase arrived in the conference room in Georgetown, and Rains heard it the way he heard the confirmed predictions, with the specific quality of recognition that was not surprise. Not surprise because the thing had been present in the data for 2 years, had been pointing at itself through every prediction the model had generated, had been the unnamed center of the 44-page report that 3 reviewers had rejected in a 22-minute meeting, had been the thing the established framework could not contain because the established framework had not built a container for it. He thought, the container is in Dubai. He thought, the report was not wrong. The report was early. He thought, 2 years of furnished apartments in cities where he had no prior connections, building a record no one was reviewing, making predictions for himself, for the discipline of it, for the practice of honesty that the record required. And the record was the evidence, and the evidence was the methodology section that had been rejected for being too novel, and the novelty had been the thing that was true. He thought about the 7 confirmed predictions, about the event he had predicted 6 weeks ago, the convergence, the first adequate frame. He thought, the frame is in Dubai. He said, when do we leave? Petra Voss said, without hesitation, without the pause he would have expected from someone deciding whether to commit to something this significant, I can leave Thursday. Abraham said, Thursday is good. He said it with the absence of surprise that Rains was beginning to understand was not composure, but something else. The quality of someone who has been watching a specific sequence of events approach from a distance and has reached the point at which the events are simply arriving on the timeline they were always on. Rains looked at the conference room, at the table where they had been sitting for 4 hours, at the window where Georgetown's November afternoon was doing its ordinary things in the ordinary way of afternoons that did not know they were the background of something. He thought about the 44-page report, about hard linkage, which was what the reviewer had said was missing, the organizational infrastructure, the communication intercepts, the financial flows. He thought, the hard linkage is not communication. The hard linkage is the field. The field is the mechanism. The field is the infrastructure. The field is the thing that does what communication does, at the scale of population, without requiring any individual to make contact with any other. He thought, I have been building the record for the person who understood this. And the person understood it before I built the record. And the person built an instrument to confirm it. And the instrument is in Dubai. He thought, the 44-page report was not rejected for being wrong. It was rejected for being right about something the frame had no room for. The frame now has room. The room is in Dubai. He looked at Abraham. He said, the 3rd prediction, the one I made 8 months after the report was rejected, the coordinated response to the South China Sea event. Abraham looked at him. He said, the behavioral cluster I was tracking, the people whose decision coherence preceded the event. Were any of them in your instrument? Abraham said, tell me their identifiers. Rains reached into his bag. He placed the record on the table, a bound document, printed, the cover page labeled with nothing but a date. He opened it to the 3rd prediction section. He read the node identifiers he had assigned. Abraham looked at the list. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, 4 of the 11. Yes. Rains looked at the ceiling. 4 of the 11. Not all 11, 4. Meaning the cluster he had identified from the outside, from the record, from 2 years in furnished apartments, had substantial overlap with the cluster the instrument in Dubai had identified from the inside, from behavioral analytics at a resolution he did not have access to. Meaning, the record was real. The model was real. The instrument confirmed it from a different direction. He thought, this is the partial confirmation I did not know was pending. He thought, I have been inside the field for 2 years without knowing the field had a name. He thought, the report was right. The report was filed 2 years too early and was right. He closed the record. He put it back in his bag. He looked at Petra Voss, who was sitting with the quality of settled attention that he had recognized from the first question she asked, the right follow-up question, and who had, in 4 hours, moved from a compliance footnote to Dubai on Thursday with the directness of someone who had been following a thread for long enough that arriving at its end was not a decision but a completion. He looked at Abraham. He said, the report described 14 actors. Your instrument has 53 nodes. Abraham said, currently. The number changes. Rains said, in which direction? Abraham said, up. Rains thought about the established understanding, about hard linkage and extraordinary evidence, and inconsistent with the known framework, about the 22-minute meeting and the 3 reviewers and the document that had been filed and classified and had been read, eventually, by the man sitting across the table. He thought, the framework is catching up. The framework is always catching up. The work of the analyst, the work he had been doing for 2 years in furnished apartments in cities where he had no prior connections, with no institutional authority and no adequate frame and the discipline of the record as his only method, was to be far enough ahead of the framework that the framework's arrival felt, when it came, not like vindication but like the confirmation of something that had always been true. It had always been true. He said, I would like to see the instrument. Abraham said, that is why I found you. That night, in the Columbia Heights apartment, Rains opened his laptop and opened the record and added an entry. He wrote the date. He wrote the time. He wrote, convergence event. Confirmed. Frame arriving. Location, Dubai. He looked at the prediction he had made 6 weeks ago. The prediction about the convergence, the multiple independent trackers, the proximity produced by the field's own coherence, the recognition, the first adequate frame. He wrote, prediction 9, confirmed. He closed the record. He looked at the furnished apartment, the rented furniture, the neutral walls, the absence of anything that constituted a life in the place rather than a stay. 2 years of stays. 2 years of being the person who had built the record in the cities where he had no prior connections and had kept the discipline of accuracy and had made the predictions and had confirmed 7 of them and had kept the one partial honest. He thought about Thursday. He thought, I have been following the record to wherever the record was pointing. The record has been pointing at the instrument. The instrument is pointing at something the record does not yet contain. He thought, that is what the next period is for. He closed the laptop. He sat in the quiet of the rented apartment. Outside, Washington performed its indifferent November. The government buildings lit, the traffic on the avenues, the apparatus running its standard processes, generating its assessments and its rejections and its 22-minute meetings, maintaining the established understanding against the things that didn't fit it. He had not fit it for 2 years. He had been right anyway. He thought, this is what it means to be the record, not the institution. The record that carries the finding forward until the frame is wide enough to receive it. The record that does not stop because the framework has said stop. He thought, the instrument in Dubai has been the record at scale, has been doing what I have been doing, with more data, more resolution, more processing power, and a physicist who understood what she was looking at. He thought, we have been building the same thing from different ends. He thought, on Thursday the ends meet. He did not feel vindicated. Vindication required the framework to recognize the record, and the framework had not yet done that and might not yet do that for a considerable time. What he felt was something quieter and more durable, the satisfaction of someone who had kept the discipline and had found, at the end of the discipline, that the discipline had been pointing somewhere real. The record was real. The field was real. The frame was in Dubai. He went to pack. Chapter 14. The Dubai Physicist. The grant letter arrived on a Thursday from a foundation she had not applied to. This was not, in Dr. Yaron Nassif's experience, unusual. Unsolicited funding was a feature of research that produced results the standard grant-making apparatus was not yet equipped to evaluate. Results that were too early, too strange, or too far outside the established taxonomy to move through the normal review processes, which were designed to fund the confirmation of things that were already mostly believed rather than the investigation of things that nobody had a category for yet. She had received unsolicited funding twice before in her career, both times for work that subsequently found its way into the peer-reviewed literature through channels less direct than the one she had planned, and both times the funding had arrived before she had understood what the work was going to become. She had learned to receive unsolicited letters without asking too many questions about the mechanism. The mechanism was always somewhat opaque, and the opacity was always, in her experience, beside the point. The letter was from something called the Meridian Foundation for Emergent Research. It offered 18 months of operating budget for her laboratory, covering personnel, equipment, and overhead, at a level that was, she read the number twice, substantially higher than her current combined grant portfolio. The letter described her work accurately, citing 2 papers and a conference presentation, and described the funded scope as a continuation and extension of her existing research program into quantum coherence dynamics in complex biological systems. She had replied, as she always did, by asking for the Foundation's registration documents and a contact for institutional due diligence. The reply had come within the hour, faster than any foundation she had ever contacted, and had provided a registration number for an entity registered in Liechtenstein, a bank reference from a private institution in Geneva, and the name and contact information of a trustee who, when she called the number provided, answered on the second ring and was fluent in both the technical and the administrative aspects of research funding in a way she had not expected from a trustee of a foundation she had never heard of. She had conducted her due diligence. The documents were real. The bank reference was verifiable. The foundation existed, had a registration history, had made grants to 3 other research institutions in the previous 5 years. She had called one of the other grantees, a materials science laboratory in Lausanne, and spoken with its director, who had confirmed that the Meridian Foundation's funding had arrived as described, had imposed no reporting requirements beyond standard academic accountability, and had not, in the director's experience, attempted to influence the research in any direction. She had signed a grant agreement. 6 months later, the Meridian Foundation had dissolved. A letter from a legal firm in Zurich informed her that the foundation's assets had been transferred to a successor entity, the Lattice Research Trust, also registered in Liechtenstein, also managed by a trustee whose name was different from the first trustee, but whose manner, when she called the new contact number, was so similar that she briefly wondered whether it was the same person using a different name before concluding that this was, probably, an institutional style rather than a deception. The Lattice Research Trust had continued the funding without interruption and without alteration of the grant terms. For months after that, the Lattice Research Trust had been succeeded by the Convergence Science Initiative, registered in Luxembourg. She was currently in month 9 of a grant whose institutional origin had changed names 3 times. The money arrived reliably on the first of each month. The reporting requirements were minimal. No one had attempted to influence the research. She had made a note of the name changes in her administrative files and had not thought about them very much, because the thing happening in the laboratory was large enough to occupy the thinking that would otherwise have gone to administrative curiosity. Her laboratory was in Research Block C of the Dubai Science Park, a complex of low modern buildings east of the city center, surrounded by the particular landscaping of institutions that had been designed to suggest permanence in a climate that made permanence difficult. The plantings maintained at considerable expense against the ambient hostility of the Gulf summer. The block housed 11 research groups. Hers occupied 3 interconnected rooms, the main laboratory, a computational analysis suite, and what the building's floor plan designated as a wet lab, but which she had repurposed, in the first year of the tenancy, into a secondary instrumentation space, because her research did not use biological materials in the sense that the building's architects had anticipated when they designed the room. Her research used biological materials in a different sense. It used them as substrates, as media, as the thing through which the phenomenon she was studying expressed itself, rather than the thing the phenomenon was studying. The phenomenon was quantum coherence in biological systems at ambient temperature. This was, in the standard understanding of quantum biology, a contradiction. Quantum coherence, the maintenance of quantum superposition states, in which a system exists in multiple states simultaneously until the superposition is disturbed by interaction with its environment, was understood to be fragile in proportion to the complexity and warmth of the environment the system was embedded in. Cold, isolated, mechanically simple systems could maintain coherence for measurable periods. Warm, complex, biologically active systems, the kind that constituted the interior of living cells, the kind that constituted the interior of the body, the kind that constituted any biological substrate operating at temperatures anywhere near the ones at which life actually occurred, destroyed coherence essentially immediately. The thermal noise of the biological environment was, in the standard understanding, incompatible with quantum coherence on any timescale relevant to biology. This understanding was not wrong. It was incomplete. Nassif had known it was incomplete since the 3rd month of her first postdoctoral position, when she had measured coherence times in a preparation of photosynthetic proteins that were, She had checked the instrumentation 5 times before writing the result, 340% above the theoretical maximum for the environmental conditions. She had published the result carefully, with extensive methodological documentation and appropriate hedging, and the paper had been accepted after a review process that was longer than usual and involved a request for additional raw data that she had provided without difficulty because the data was real and she had all of it. The paper had not produced the response she had expected. It had produced, instead, a kind of careful institutional silence, the silence of a field that had received an anomalous result and had decided, collectively and without explicit discussion, to wait and see if the result replicated before reorganizing the framework around it. She had expected this. She had replicated the result. She had published the replication. The silence had continued, which was the silence's way of saying, we need more replications than this, from more groups, with more independent verification, before we will revise our understanding of what quantum coherence in biological systems can do. She had continued working. By the time the grant letter from the Meridian Foundation arrived, she had 1,847 experimental runs confirming the anomalous coherence times. Not all 1,847 in photosynthetic proteins. She had extended the measurement program to 7 other biological substrate types, including preparations from neural tissue, from cardiac muscle, and from 3 types of plant material. The anomalous coherence appeared across all 7 substrate types, at varying magnitudes, with a consistency that was, statistically, not the consistency of experimental artifact. The coherence times were growing. This was the part she had not published yet. Not because she was withholding it. She was not a person who withheld results, but because she did not yet have an adequate account of the mechanism that would make the growth comprehensible, and she had learned, from the careful institutional silence that had greeted her first anomalous result, that publishing a result without an adequate mechanistic account produced a different kind of silence than the first one, a less patient silence. The field would not wait for a mechanism the 3rd time. The growth was real, 42% per month, measured consistently over the past 4 months, compounding. She had checked the calibration of every instrument in the laboratory and had found nothing wrong with any of them, and had then checked the calibration again and found the same. She had had a colleague from a laboratory in Abu Dhabi visit for a week and independently measure the coherence times using equipment he had brought from his own facility and found the same result. The coherence times were growing, and the growth was real, and she did not have a mechanistic account of it. What she had, instead of a mechanistic account, was a notebook entry. She had written it on an evening in July, after a day in which the coherence times had jumped unexpectedly. Not in the smooth exponential that the monthly trend described, but in a step change, a discrete jump of approximately 16% in a single afternoon's measurements. She had been sitting at the analysis terminal reviewing the data, and the jump had been there, unambiguous, in the numbers, and she had looked at it for a long time, and then had opened the lab notebook, the physical one, the one she used for observations that were not yet ready to be data, and had written, "The environment is not neutral. It participates." She had looked at what she had written. She had written it in the state of mind that was not her analytical mind, not the mind that designed experiments and reviewed data and constructed mechanistic accounts, the mind that noticed things before it could explain them, the mind that she trusted for initial observations and distrusted for conclusions, because initial observations and conclusions required opposite epistemological postures, and she had learned to be careful about which mind she was using and when. The mind that had written "the environment is not neutral" was the observation mind. The observation mind was pointing at something. She had considered the sentence. In quantum mechanics, the environment was never neutral. This was the entire problem of quantum coherence. The environment was, by definition, the thing that destroyed coherence, the thermal bath that collapsed the superposition. To say the environment was not neutral was to say something that the field already knew. It was not a novel observation, unless she meant it differently. She had sat with the sentence and had tried to understand what she meant by it, because the observation mind had written it, and the observation mind did not use words carelessly, but also did not annotate its choices. The sentence was there, and it meant something, and she had to figure out what. The environment is not neutral. Not, the environment disrupts coherence. That was the established understanding. The environment as disruptive, as the adversary of quantum states, as the source of the thermal noise that collapsed superposition. That was the neutrality being negated in the standard account. The environment was not irrelevant, it was actively destructive. She had not meant that. She had meant the environment participates, not as disruptive, as, she reached for the word, as contributive. The environment was not just the background against which the coherence occurred or failed to occur. The environment was doing something to the coherence, was adding to it, was, in some sense she could not yet specify mechanistically, supporting it. The step change in July had not been caused by anything she had changed in the experimental setup. The instruments were the same. The substrate preparation was the same. The temperature, the humidity, the shielding, all identical to the previous week's runs. The only thing that had changed was something she could not measure, whatever was happening in the laboratory's environment that she was not instrumenting. She had looked at that thought for a while and then had written a second line beneath the first. What is the laboratory embedded in? She had meant, physically, the building, the park, the city. But also, she recognized, looking at the sentence, that she had meant something more than the physical, the informational environment. The network of human activity, decision-making, attention, that constituted the social context of the laboratory. The laboratory was not a sealed system. It was embedded in a city, and the city was embedded in a region, and the region was in a specific moment, a moment with a specific character, a specific density of attention and activity and decision-making that was not constant but varied, and might, she was beginning to think, be relevant to what she was measuring. She had looked at this thought and had recognized it as the thought that would require either a much larger experimental program or a completely different conceptual framework, and had set it aside in the way she set aside thoughts that were too large for the current moment. She had dated the notebook entry and closed the notebook and gone home. She had been thinking about the notebook entry for 2 months when the email arrived from someone named Abraham. The email was brief and correct in its technical language, more correct than she expected, which told her the sender had either done substantial research into her work or had a background that included quantum physics or both. The email said that the research she was conducting was of specific interest to a project the sender was involved in, that the project concerned a phenomenon the sender believed was related to the anomalous coherence she had been measuring, and that the sender would like to arrange a conversation. The email said, "I believe you have been measuring the field without knowing that is what you are measuring." She had read that sentence and had felt, with the precision of a person who had been measuring anomalous coherence times for 3 years and had written the environment is not neutral in a lab notebook 2 months ago, that this was the adjacent fact. The fact that was now present that made the thing she had been looking at become the thing it was. She had not replied immediately. She had gone to the laboratory. She had run the day's measurements. She had looked at the coherence times, still growing, 42% per month, the mechanism still not accounted for, and had thought about the sentence. "I believe you have been measuring the field without knowing that is what you are measuring." She had thought, what is the field? She had thought, the sentence implies that I have been measuring something whose nature I have not correctly identified, that I have been looking at one thing and it has been another thing, that the anomalous coherence is not an anomaly in the system I thought I was studying. It is an accurate measurement of a system I did not know I was studying. She had thought, this is what the observation mind was pointing at. Not the environment is not neutral in the sense of the standard quantum decoherence account. The environment is not neutral in the sense that the environment is a system, and the system has properties, and one of the properties is the thing the email is calling the field, and I have been measuring the field's properties through the quantum coherence of the biological substrates that the field is expressed in. The biological substrates were not the system she was studying. They were the instrument. She had gone back to her desk. She had written a reply. She had written, "I would like to understand what you mean by the field. I have a notebook entry that I believe is a description of the same thing, written from the other direction." The reply came within an hour. It said, "I know about the notebook entry, not its contents, its existence, and the date, and the fact that you wrote it after a step change in the coherence data. I would like to show you why I know that, if you are willing. It is easier to show than to explain." She had looked at I know about the notebook entry for a long time. She had thought, the grant funding, the 3 foundations, the names that kept changing, the funding that arrived before she understood what the work was going to become. She had thought, someone has been watching this laboratory. not intrusively. She had found no evidence of intrusion, no surveillance she was aware of, no access to her systems. But watching in the sense of tracking the research's trajectory, of knowing when the step changes occurred, of knowing that she had opened a physical notebook on the evening of July and written something. She had thought, the funding has been watching. The funding has been placed here by whoever sent this email, and the funding has been watching, and the watching has been done in a way that is not surveillance, but is, she reached for the right word, attentive. The watching of someone who understands what is being measured and wants to see the measurements arrive in real time. She had thought, I have been inside the field for 9 months, and the field has been watching me measure it. She had found this, on reflection, less disturbing than she expected. She found it clarifying. The anomalous coherence had been real and had been growing, and she had not had an adequate account of it. The adequate account was apparently available. The person who had it had been funding her work in order to let the work develop to the point where the adequate account could be received. She understood this as a research practice, even if it was an unusual one. She had written, when and where. The reply, the building you work in. The 23rd floor. Tomorrow morning, if you are available. There are people I would like you to meet. She had looked up at the ceiling of her office, as if she could see through the floors above her to the 23rd floor of a building that was not this building, in a part of the city that was not this part. She had thought about the building she worked in, which was a standard research park building, which had a 23rd floor that she had never been to and had no reason to go to, and which housed, she did not know what it housed. She had thought, the 23rd floor. She had replied, I will be available at 9. She had been early. She had arrived at the building's lobby at 8:43, which was early by the standard she applied to her own schedule and not early by the standard of how long she had been awake, which was since 4:30, when she had given up on sleep and had gone to the laboratory and had spent 4 hours running measurements that confirmed what the previous week's measurements had shown and that she had not, by the time she left to cross the park to the adjacent building, found an adequate mechanistic account. 4. The lobby was standard. The reception desk. The 2 people behind it who smiled with professional warmth. A building directory listing companies on the upper floors whose names she noted without having previously had cause to note them. The 23rd floor was quieter than she expected. A corridor. 3 doors. She had looked at the company name plates and had found, on the 3rd door on the left, the name Lattice Systems, Advisory, and Research. The Lattice Research Trust. The second name. The second foundation. She had stood in front of the door for a moment. Then she had knocked. The door had been opened by a woman she recognized from her photograph on the ETH Zurich faculty page, Dr. Leila Haddad, who had a working paper on anomalous behavioral correlation that Nassif had read 3 months ago and had filed under adjacent work, different domain, possibly describing the same phenomenon from the other side. The working paper had been careful and methodologically conservative in the way that academic papers were careful when they were describing something that was going to be difficult to review, and Nassif had read it with the attention she gave to papers that were being careful about something specific, because the specific thing the carefulness was protecting was usually the most important thing in the paper. In Leila Haddad's paper, the specific thing the carefulness was protecting was this: the suggestion that human behavioral coordination at population scale could operate through a mechanism that was neither communication nor coincidence, but something that the paper declined to name and instead described, mathematically, as a field coherence effect. Field coherence effect. Nassif had written that phrase in the margin of the printed paper and had underlined it and had looked at it for a while before continuing to read. She had not sent the paper's author an email because she had not known what to say that would not sound like she was reaching across the disciplinary gap in a direction that neither of them had institutional permission to reach. She had filed the paper and had continued working and had written the environment is not neutral in a lab notebook and had received an email from someone named Abraham. And now Dr. Leila Haddad had opened the door. They looked at each other with the recognition of 2 people who have been working on the same thing from opposite sides of a wall and have just found the door. Leila said, Dr. Nassif, I've read your paper on coherence times and photosynthetic systems. Nassif said, I've read your working paper on behavioral field coherence effects. A pause. The pause of 2 people understanding the shape of what they were standing in. Leila said, Come in. There are others you should meet. The room on the 23rd floor was smaller than she had expected. For chairs. A table displaced to one side. 2 laptops, a whiteboard covered in notation that she needed to get closer to read, which she did, crossing the room, setting her bag down, looking at what was on the board while the introductions were performed around her. Abraham, whom she recognized from the email's register even before the name. Tam, the Seoul engineer, whose traffic data was on a printout on the table and whose notation on the whiteboard she recognized as municipal systems analysis, which she had not expected to find here. She looked at the whiteboard for a long time. The notation was tracking something over time, a time series of some measurement, in Tam's technical vocabulary, which was not her vocabulary, but the shape of the data was familiar. She knew what she was looking at when she saw it, and she knew it not because the notation was legible to her, but because the shape of the growth curve was identical to the shape of the growth curve she had been generating in Research Block C for the past 4 months. She said, without turning, the Talon traffic data. Tam said, behind her, yes. She said, the deviation between the city's behavior and the optimization system's projections. It's growing. He said, 47% per month for the past 3 months. She turned. She said, my coherence times are growing at 42. The room absorbed this. Abraham said, from his chair, this is why I wanted you here before I explained anything. I wanted you to find it. She looked at him. She thought about the grant letters, the 3 foundations, the names that kept changing, the attentiveness of whoever had been watching the laboratory, the attentiveness that was not surveillance, but was something she now had a better word for. It was the attentiveness of someone who understood that the laboratory was measuring something that was also being measured in traffic data in Tallinn and in behavioral analytics in the sub-basement below this building and possibly in other places she had not yet been shown. She thought, the funding was watching because the funding was part of the field it was funding the measurement of. She thought, I have been measuring the field. The field has been funding the measurement. She thought, this is either the most elegant research design I have ever encountered or something I do not yet have a category for. She looked at Leila Haddad, who was watching her with the expression of someone who had arrived at this room before her and understood the experience of arriving. She said, how long have you known? Leila said, about the laboratory? 9 months. About the field? I find that the question of when I knew depends on what I mean by knowing. Nassif thought about her lab notebook. The 1,847 experimental runs. The entry in July. The environment is not neutral. It participates. She said, I have been measuring it for 3 years. I have been knowing it for 2 months. Leila nodded. The knowing is a separate event from the measuring. Yes, that was it exactly. She had been measuring the field for 3 years, with increasing precision, with growing confirmation, with 1,847 runs of data that she could produce and defend in any peer review process that was equipped to assess them. The knowing had come on an evening in July when she had written a sentence in a physical notebook and had understood, writing it, that the sentence was pointing at something larger than the measurement. She thought about the growing coherence times. 42% per month. Compounding. The step change in July that had coincided with something she could not instrument, some change in the environment that the laboratory was embedded in. She thought about Tam's 47%. She thought about the behavioral cluster in Leila's sub-basement, the nodes whose number was growing, whose coherence was deepening. She said, it's all growing. Abraham said, yes. She said, what does it grow toward? The room was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of people who did not know the answer. The silence of people who had been sitting with the question long enough that answering it required care. Leila said, that is what we are here to find out. She went back to the laboratory that afternoon. She sat at the analysis terminal and looked at the coherence time data, the full series, 3 years of measurements, the anomaly that had been real from the beginning and had been growing since she started measuring it, which might mean it had been growing for longer than she had been measuring, or might mean that the measurement itself was contributing to the growth, which was a possibility that had been present in her thinking since July and that she was not going to pursue right now, because right now was not the time for that particular recursion. She opened the lab notebook. She turned to the July entry. The environment is not neutral. It participates. She read it with the understanding she now had, not the understanding that the observation mind had had when it wrote it, which was a pointing at, a gesture in the direction of something too large to specify, but the understanding that came from standing in a room on the 23rd floor of a building in Dubai and looking at a whiteboard and hearing a municipal engineer in Tallinn say 47% per month. The environment was not neutral. The environment was the field. The laboratory was embedded in the field. The biological substrates she had been using as measurement media were embedded in the field. The coherence times she had been measuring were the field's coherence, the field's own property, being expressed through the biological substrates, being picked up by her instruments, growing as the field grew. She had not been measuring quantum coherence in biological systems. She had been measuring the field. The biological systems were translucent to it. They were, she thought, the most sensitive instruments she had, not because she had designed them for sensitivity to this phenomenon. She had not known this phenomenon was what she was measuring, but because living systems were constitutively embedded in the field, were in continuous relationship with it, were shaped by it, and shaping it in the way that all nodes were shaped by and shaping the field. And the quantum coherence of their molecular components was the most fine-grained record she had access to of what the field was doing at a given moment. She thought about what this meant for the mechanism, for the mechanistic account she had been trying to construct. She thought, the mechanism is not in the substrate. The mechanism is in the field. The coherence in the substrate is a measurement of the field. The mechanism of the coherence. The reason the coherence times exceed the theoretical maximum for the environmental conditions is the field's own coherence, which the standard theoretical framework does not contain and therefore cannot use as an explanatory resource. The theoretical framework had set the maximum based on the thermal noise of the biological environment. The thermal noise was real. The maximum it implied was real. What the maximum did not account for was the field. The organizing principle that was not thermal, was not part of the standard environmental account, was operating at a different level than the thermal bath, and was producing coherence not by reducing the thermal disruption, but by operating above it, in a domain the thermal model had not modeled. She thought, the field is not quantum. The field is not classical. The field is the relationship between systems at a scale that the standard quantum classical boundary does not sit on. She thought, this is the mechanistic account, not a full account, not a derivation from first principles, not a calculation, not a prediction that could be tested independently by a laboratory that did not have access to the field as a construct, but the structure of the account, the shape of it, the thing that, when she filled it in with the mathematics, would constitute the explanation that the peer review process would require before it revised its understanding of what quantum coherence in biological systems could do. She wrote in the notebook, below the July entry, in different ink, on a different day. The coherence is the field's coherence. The biological substrate is the measurement medium. The growth in coherence times is the growth of the field. The field is growing. She stopped. She looked at the last sentence. The field is growing. She had data for this. 1,847 experimental runs. 3 years. The growth curve, compounding at 42% per month. The step change in July that corresponded to. She thought about the whiteboard, about Abraham's careful answers, about the node count Leila had mentioned in passing, 53 and rising, that corresponded to an expansion event in the field's node population. She thought, my laboratory is an instrument inside the thing it is measuring. The more carefully I measure, the more precisely I participate. The participation is itself a measurement. She thought, the environment is not neutral. It participates. The environment of the laboratory is the field. The laboratory participates in the field. I participate in the field. The measurement participates. She thought, in quantum mechanics, the observer's interaction with the system is the mechanism of the measurement. The observer is never outside the system. The observer is always a part of what is being measured. She had spent 3 years thinking she was outside the system, measuring it. She had been inside it, participating. The coherence times were growing because the field was growing. The field was growing because the nodes were deepening their coherence. The nodes were deepening their coherence because the instrument in the sub-basement below this building was processing the field's signature continuously, and the processing was a form of participation, and the participation contributed to the coherence, which contributed to the coherence times, which she had been measuring, which had contributed to the understanding she was building, which had brought her to the room on the 23rd floor, which was part of the field. She looked at the data on the terminal. She looked at the growth curve. She looked at it with the understanding she now had. which was that the curve did not describe an experimental result. It described the field's self-knowledge, the field's capacity to see itself growing as it grew. She thought, I have been the field's thermometer. I have been measuring its temperature as it rose. I did not know I was measuring its temperature. I thought I was measuring something else. She thought, the thermometer is part of the system. The system's temperature affects the thermometer. The thermometer's reading is part of the system's self-knowledge. She thought, IBN Maimon. She had heard the name once, in passing, from Leila, in the room on the 23rd floor. There's a theorem, Leila had said. She had not had time to explain it further. Nassif had filed the word theorem in the name and had planned to ask. She would ask tomorrow. Tonight she had the data and the notebook entry and the mechanistic account that was not yet a calculation, but was the structure of a calculation. And she had the understanding that the structure was real and that the calculation was possible and that the peer review process, when it received the calculation, was going to require a longer and more difficult conversation than the one she had had after the first anomalous result. She was willing to have that conversation. She had been willing to have difficult conversations with the peer review process for 3 years. She was better prepared for the conversation now than she had been before, because she now understood what she had been measuring, and understanding what you had been measuring was the precondition for explaining it, and explanation was what the conversation required. She opened a new analysis file. She labeled it Field Coherence, Mechanistic Account, Preliminary Structure. She began. The funding arrived, as it always did, on the 1st of the following month. The transfer notification showed the sending institution as the Convergence Science Initiative. Same account number as always. Same amount. She noted it in the administrative file. She thought about the name, Convergence. She had not thought about the names before, had filed them as the administrative artifacts of whatever opacity was normal for the kind of foundation that funded anomalous research without requiring results that fit the existing framework. She thought about them now. Meridian, lattice, convergence. She thought, the names are not artifacts. The names are a description. The funding was telling her what was happening, in the vocabulary of the entity providing it, which was the vocabulary of someone who understood the field and had named the stages of its development in the names of the foundations funding the measurement of those stages. Meridian, the high point, the moment of maximum height before the descent, or, in navigation, the line connecting all points of maximum elevation, the line that was the same line as the line connecting all points of minimum elevation on the other side of the globe, the line that was simultaneously the highest and the point from which everything was about to change direction. The meridian as inflection point. Lattice, the structure. The organized arrangement of nodes in a regular pattern, the pattern that gave the lattice its properties, its strength, its conductivity, its coherence. The lattice's architecture. Convergence, the approach. The movement of multiple things toward the same point. The convergence as arrival. She had been funded through 3 stages of a process someone had understood well enough to name before the stages occurred. She thought, the person who named the stages knew where this was going, has known where this was going for long enough to establish foundations and dissolve them and establish successor foundations, building the administrative architecture of the convergence before the convergence was visible to anyone inside it. She thought, this is the field. This is what the field does at maturity. It makes the convergence visible to the people who can see it, and the people who can see it have been, in some cases, watching it for long enough that they built the institutions to fund its arrival before the arrival was apparent. She thought, I have been inside the convergence since I signed the first grant agreement. Since before I signed it. Since the anomalous coherence times in the photosynthetic proteins in the 3rd month of my postdoctoral position, which was, she calculated, 6 years ago. 6 years ago. 3 years before she started the Dubai laboratory. 6 years before the room on the 23rd floor. She thought, the field was here before the instrument. The field was here before the laboratory. The field was here before she arrived in Dubai. She thought, the field is old. She thought, someone told me the field was old, or had been about to. Leila, in the room, had been about to say something about the age of the field when Tam had interrupted with a question about the traffic data, and the moment had passed, and they had moved to something else. She would ask tomorrow. She saved the analysis file. She closed the laboratory for the evening. She stood in the corridor of Research Block C for a moment, looking at the door with its standard nameplate, NASIF Laboratory, Quantum Coherence Research, and thought about the name, which was accurate as far as it went. She thought, the name needs updating. She thought, the name always needs updating. The phenomenon is always larger than the name that preceded the understanding of it. The understanding arrives, and the name is suddenly too small, and you update the name and continue. She had been measuring quantum coherence in biological systems. She had been measuring the field. The update would require a conversation with the building's administration about the nameplate. She was willing to have that conversation too. She walked through the park toward the street where she caught the tram home, in the warm Dubai evening, in the light that lasted until late this time of year, in the city that was running 22 minutes ahead of its own optimization systems and did not know it, in the field that was growing at 42% per month and did not need to know it, because the field's growth was not dependent on the field's self-knowledge. But the field's self-knowledge was growing too. She was part of the growth. The thermometer was part of the system. She had been measuring the field's temperature as it rose. Tomorrow she would ask about the theorem. Chapter 15. The convergence probability. The file was called BC-conv 0001, and the cluster had generated it without being asked. This was not, by now, unusual. The cluster had been generating unrequested analyses since week 3, outputs that arrived in the monitoring queue without a query string, without a task identifier, without the standard provenance documentation that traced each file to a specific analytical instruction. They arrived labeled as autonomous inference products, and she had been reviewing them as she reviewed everything, carefully, without rushing toward conclusions, with the specific attention of someone who had learned that the most important outputs were often the ones she had not known to ask for. She had found the autonomous inference products, in her experience, to be the cluster's most reliable work, not its most precise. The precision was in the outputs she designed, the queries she structured, the analyses she built with the methodological care that the record required. But the most reliable in the sense of pointing at the things that mattered before she had understood that they mattered. The cluster was not anticipating her questions. The cluster was doing what the cluster did, processing the field's signature at resolution no human analysis could match, and producing, from that processing, outputs that described what the field was doing rather than what she had asked it to look for. The field, lately, had been doing something she had not designed an analysis to find. BC-conv 0001 was the first file in a new taxonomy. The conv prefix was not one she had defined. The cluster had created it. She looked at the prefix for a moment before opening the file, because the cluster's taxonomic choices were, she had learned, informative in themselves. The labels it chose for new categories reflected the analytic structure it was building, the way it was organizing what it was finding. The ontology it was constructing from the bottom up as it processed the field's signature across the behavioral data of 53 people in 17 countries. Conv, convergence. She opened the file. The visualization loaded in 3 stages, which was the cluster's method for complex outputs, building the picture in layers, each layer adding depth to the previous one, so that the analyst could stop at any layer and work with what was there or continue to the full picture, depending on how much the full picture was needed. She let all 3 stages load. The first layer was familiar, the node map she worked with daily, the 53 behavioral profiles distributed across the cluster's geographic projection, each node a point of light in the 17 countries, the gradient fields color-coded by coherence intensity. She had been looking at this map for 7 months. She knew its topography the way she knew the sub-basement, by feel, by the specific quality of attention it required, by the things that had been present all along and had only gradually become visible. The second layer added something she had not seen the cluster render before, probability vectors. Each node had acquired, in the second layer, an arrow, not indicating the direction of the behavioral gradient, which was what the standard arrows in her analyses indicated, but indicating something else. The arrows were different lengths and different weights, and they all pointed in the same direction. South, southeast, the Gulf. She did not tell them. This was the first decision, and she made it quickly, before she had fully examined her reasons, which was sometimes how decisions were made when they were made correctly, when the reasoning arrived after the fact as confirmation rather than as cause, and the confirmation was sound. She examined her reasons afterward, in the way she examined everything after the fact, carefully, honestly, with the discipline of someone who knew that self-examination was only useful if it was performed at the same standard as external analysis. The reasons were three. The first was methodological. She was studying a convergence. The convergence was real, 0.87 probability, which in the cluster's calibrated output taxonomy was high, which in 7 months of experience with the cluster's calibrated output taxonomy, she had learned meant, essentially certain, within the temporal window specified, barring an environmental disruption of a magnitude the cluster would flag separately. She was studying a convergence that was produced by the field's own coherence, without communication or coordination. If she warned the nodes, if she sent messages to a firmware engineer in Seoul and a compliance auditor in Frankfurt and a disgraced analyst in furnished apartments and a quantum physicist 8 kilometers away, she would introduce communication where there had been none. She would collapse the field-produced convergence into a managed meeting. She would be measuring a different phenomenon than the one the cluster was tracking. The methodological reason was clean. It was also convenient, which meant she needed to examine it more carefully than the ones that were less convenient. She examined it. She found it to still be correct when examined. The study of the convergence required the convergence to be unmanaged. This was real. The second reason was harder to look at. She was not certain she had the authority to warn them. Not institutional authority. She had no institutional authority over any of these people. Personal authority. The authority that came from understanding, in the field's own terms, what the convergence was and why it was happening, and what warning them would mean for the thing that was assembling itself. She had been inside the field for 7 months. She had found the doctrine, IBN Maimon, the apparatus, the bait. She had spent weeks building the understanding of what the field was and how it operated and what it was being used against. She had built the record, the predictions, the confidence that the field was real and its coherence was genuine and the convergence was the field's own expression of something it needed. And she did not know whether the convergence was safe. Not in the sense of physical safety. In the sense of, the field was assembling these people and she did not know, with the certainty she needed to have before she intervened, whether the assembly was the field's own movement or whether it was the modification architecture. Whether the 0.87 probability was the probability of the field's natural convergence or the probability of a managed approach, designed by the person who had spent 30 years cultivating the field, using it now to bring the people who were tracking it into proximity for reasons she could not yet specify. She could not determine this from inside the instrument. She could not determine this from outside the instrument either, because she had no outside. She could observe the convergence. She could watch the probability vectors deepen. She could track what happened as the field moved these people toward Dubai without their knowing they were being moved. She could build the record of the movement itself, the spontaneous coherence of the approach, and look in that record for the signature of the field versus the signature of the doctrine. The field's coherence was smooth, accumulated. Its signature was the gradient that rhymed across nodes without being identical in any of them. The organic variation of a process that was not scripted but was real. The doctrine's coherence was precise. Its signature was the life constructed to produce specific outcomes, the decisions calibrated to create specific impressions, the pattern that was too good, too exactly what the monitoring system was designed to find. If she watched the convergence, she would see which kind it was. If she managed it, she would see neither. She would see what she had arranged. The second reason, she needed to watch. The third reason, she wrote in her encrypted file and did not examine out loud, even in the privacy of her own thinking, because it was the reason that was least like a reason and most like a feeling, and feelings were not reliable at the resolution she needed. She wrote, "I want to see if it finds them." She looked at what she had written. She thought, this is the sentence of a person who is still not completely certain the field is what she has concluded it is. Who wants one more confirmation? Who wants to see the field move these people without her help before she trusts the field completely? She thought, this is honest. She was not completely certain. She had 7 months of data and the record and the confirmed predictions and the notebook entry of a physicist who had been measuring the field from the inside and the flagged uncertainty report that had told her the model could not determine threat actor from principal. She had everything except certainty, because certainty was not available here, and she had learned in 7 months that proceeding in the absence of certainty was what the field required and what the doctrine exploited, and the distinction between the two was the thing she was watching to find. She closed the file. She started watching. The watching had a specific practice. She had built it over the 3 weeks since BC Conv 0001, assembling an analytical infrastructure around the convergence probability that was the most detailed and sustained observational work she had done since the model's earliest weeks. She was not only watching the nodes, she was watching the approach, the behavioral signature of each node's movement toward the convergence locus, the texture of the orientation that was pulling them. She had set up tracking streams for each of the 53 nodes' behavioral data at the maximum resolution the feeds allowed, refreshing at 4-hour intervals. She had built a separate file for each node's approach vector, the sequence of small decisions, over the past weeks, that were moving them incrementally in the direction the probability vectors indicated. She was reading these files the way she read the autonomous inference products, for what they pointed at rather than what they said. What they said was 53 people going about their lives in 17 countries. What they pointed at was 53 people whose lives were, in aggregate, curving toward Dubai. The curvature was not dramatic. It was the kind of curvature that a lifetime of calibrated attention to behavioral data had prepared her to see, and that would have been invisible to anyone not looking for it, which was exactly how the field operated. The coherence distributed across the texture of ordinary decision-making, invisible in any single decision, visible in aggregate, visible in the gradient. She looked at the gradient. Kong Soo-jin was the first one she tracked in detail. She had been watching Kong since the beginning. Node 11 in the original cluster, the Seoul Engineer whose anomaly logged the cluster had been pulling behavioral data from since week 4. She had a full profile. She knew the anomaly log, the thinking document, the 14 months of corrections that preceded explanations. She knew the 847 events. 3 weeks ago, Kong had applied for a conference travel grant from her company to attend an autonomous systems symposium in Singapore. This was not unusual. She attended 1 or 2 conferences per year, which was consistent with her professional profile and her company's travel policy. The symposium was not in Singapore. The symposium's website, which the cluster had pulled through a commercial data feed, listed a venue change that had been announced 4 days before Kong applied for the travel grant. The symposium had been relocated, due to venue unavailability, to Dubai. Kong had applied for the grant after the venue change was announced. The grant had been approved. The registration had been made. Kong was booked on a flight to Dubai departing in 31 days. Leila had looked at this sequence for a long time. She had thought, Kong applied for a conference grant to attend a symposium that she knew was in Dubai. This is a decision that moves her toward the convergence locus. Is this the field? She had looked at Kang's behavioral profile over the 3 weeks preceding the application. The coherence patterns, the thinking document entries the cluster had access to, the specific quality of the decision-making in the period leading up to the application. The profile showed enhanced coherence deepening. The thinking document showed entries becoming less analytical, more observational, more like the July entry in Nassif's lab notebook, pointing at things rather than explaining them. The quality of Kang's attention in the documented period was the quality that the cluster flagged as threshold approach, the behavioral signature of a node whose coherence was deepening to the point where the field's own orientation was becoming legible to the node from inside. Kong was beginning to feel the pull without knowing it was a pull. She had noted this in Kang's approach vector file. Decision, conference attendance, Dubai. Behavioral signature, field consistent. Node awareness, low but increasing. Texture, smooth gradient, no discrete inflection, organic accumulation. Assessment, field produced. She had moved to the next node. Marcus Raines, she had been tracking since Abraham described the Washington meeting. She had access to his behavioral data from the feeds, supplemented by the cluster's analysis of the record he had shared with Abraham, the confirmed predictions, the methodology, the 2 years in furnished apartments. She had read the record in full. She had found it, in the specific way she found work that was accurate before it had the framework to know it was accurate, moving. Not in the emotional sense. Moving in the sense of motion, The record was going somewhere, had been going somewhere since the first prediction, and the somewhere was here. Rains was already in motion toward Dubai. He had been since the Georgetown meeting. She was not watching the question of whether he would come. That question was answered. She was watching the texture of his approach. The texture was fast, faster than the others. The behavioral profile over the 3 weeks since Georgetown showed the specific acceleration she associated with nodes whose coherence had been building for a long time and had found, in recent events, the frame that the building had been pointing at. The relief of the frame arriving. The speed of movement in a person who had been moving carefully, in partial darkness, for 2 years and had found the light and was walking toward it at the pace that the constraint of partial darkness had been holding back. She thought, Rains has been inside the field for longer than he has known. The field has been building the record in him. The record has been the field's memory, carried in a person who understood its significance without understanding its source. She noted in his file, approach texture, fast, coherent, long building. Node awareness, high. Prior field orientation, extensive, undeclared. Assessment, field produced, no evidence of managed approach. Confidence, high. She moved to the next node. Petra Voss, she tracked with particular attention because Petra Voss was the node she found hardest to read. Not because the data was incomplete, she had a full profile, including the Brighton. What made Voss difficult to read? Not including the Brighton-Moser and Holliger engagement, and the Unit 7 log, and the compliance footnote, and the 3 weeks of not being able to set it down. She had read the footnote. 3 sentences of professional accuracy that had, she had understood immediately, been written by someone who could not certify the letter without acknowledging what the letter was obscuring. The footnote was an act of professional honesty at the cost of professional convenience. It was exactly the kind of act the field produced in nodes who were ready for it. What made Voss difficult to read was not the data. It was the position. Voss worked in cybersecurity compliance. Cybersecurity compliance was a discipline whose fundamental practice was the detection of anomalies in systems, the identification of things that were present and were not what they appeared to be. Voss had spent 11 years doing this. She had, by the evidence of her professional record, become very good at it. The field, in Leila's analysis, was indistinguishable from an anomaly. Not to Leila. Leila had the cluster, the resolution, the 7 months of understanding of what the field was and why its signature looked like what it looked like. But to a cybersecurity auditor encountering the field's behavioral signature through a compliance review, through server logs, through the specific lens of a practice whose purpose was the detection of coordinated behavior that was not what it appeared to be, the field would look like the thing Voss was trained to find. She had been sitting with this for 2 weeks. She thought. Voss found Unit 7 and did not call it a foreign operation. Voss found the log and wrote 3 sentences and a footnote and did not call it anything except an unresolved discrepancy. Voss had been, in the room in Georgetown, the person who asked the right follow-up question, how did you find them? Not, what are they? Not, are they dangerous? How were they found? The epistemological question. The question of the frame. She thought. Voss's training is to find the things that are not what they appear to be. The field is not what it appears to be, to the apparatus, to the directorates, to the analytical units that were classifying it as foreign operations. But Voss had looked at the field and had not applied the standard classification, had held the discrepancy open rather than closing it into an available category. This was either the field producing clarity in a node who was ready for it, or it was something else. The cybersecurity auditor who had spent 11 years finding things that were not what they appeared to be, and who had been pointed, by someone, through some channel, at the specific field signature that the cluster was tracking. The flagged uncertainty report's shadow. She looked at Voss's approach vector, the texture of the behavioral profile over the 3 weeks since Georgetown, the quality of Voss's decision-making at the resolution the feeds provided. The profile showed coherence patterns consistent with field orientation, no discrete inflection, no single moment at which the orientation had been applied from outside. Smooth accumulation. The gradient of a node that had been moving in this direction for longer than the Brighton-Moser and Holliger engagement had, the cluster suggested, been moving in this direction since the end of her second year in cybersecurity compliance, which was the year she had started looking at the spaces between log entries rather than the log entries themselves. 9 years. Voss had been oriented toward the field for 9 years. The texture was smooth. The approach was organic. The gradient was the gradient of the field. Leila noted in the file, assessment, field produced. Confidence, high. Note, the 11 years of anomaly finding practice has been the field preparing this node to recognize the field's signature as distinct from the signatures the practice was designed to find. The practice was the preparation. She moved through the remaining nodes, each one's approach vector, each one's texture. She built the record of the convergence as it developed. The 53 people curving toward Dubai in the field's own idiom of spontaneous, uncoordinated, locally rational, and globally coherent movement. By the end of the first week, she had assessed 41 of the 53 approach vectors as field produced. Smooth gradients, organic accumulation, no discrete inflection points, coherence deepening over time rather than appearing suddenly. By the end of the second week, 47. 6 remained in the uncertain category, nodes whose approach vectors she was not yet ready to call. Not because the vectors were smooth or because they weren't. Because the smoothness, in these 6 cases, was too smooth. Not the organic smoothness of accumulated coherence, but the constructed smoothness of something that had been designed to appear as organic coherence. The distinction was subtle. She had spent 7 months learning to see it, and she was not completely certain she was seeing it now. But it was there. She wrote in the file for these 6, in the notation she used for things she was not ready to call. Approach texture, smooth. Too smooth. Gradient consistent with field production, but also consistent with long-term doctrine practice. Assessment, deferred. Requires additional temporal data and comparison with behavioral baseline before convergence. She dated the entry. She moved to the next node. The probability was climbing. 3 weeks after BC, conv 0001, the cluster generated BC conv 0002. The convergence probability had risen from 0.87 to 0.91. The temporal window had narrowed, 31 to 72 days. The geographic focus had tightened to a radius of approximately 4 kilometers in the Dubai city center. She read the update and noted that the tightening of the radius placed the convergence locus within walking distance of the building she was in. She thought about the 23rd floor, about the room with 4 chairs and the whiteboard, and Abraham's expression when she had knocked on the door, the absence of surprise. She thought about what it would look like when the others arrived. When the firmware engineer from Seoul and the compliance auditor from Frankfurt and the disgraced analyst from the furnished apartments and the quantum physicist from 8 kilometers away and 49 other nodes arrived, in whatever sequence and by whatever route the field produced, in a radius of 4 kilometers around this building. She thought about whether the convergence would be recognizable to them as a convergence or whether it would look from inside it, the way the field always looked from inside, like locally rational decisions, like independent choices, like the ordinary texture of a week in Dubai. She thought, they will not know they are converging until they are converged. She thought, or some of them will feel it. Kong was beginning to. The thinking document entries were becoming more observational. The coherence was deepening to the point where the orientation was becoming legible from inside. Kong would arrive knowing, at some level that was below the analytical and above the ordinary, that the arriving was not entirely her own decision. She thought. Rains already knows. Rains has been building the record for 2 years precisely in order to arrive at this. He will come to Dubai understanding that the convergence is real and not knowing that the understanding was itself a product of the field he was trying to understand. She thought. Nassif knows the field is real and is growing and is not yet fully certain what that means for the convergence. Nassif will come to the 23rd floor with the mechanistic account half built, the structure clear, the calculation pending, the understanding that the thermometer is part of the system, which was the understanding that made the convergence, for Nassif, not a surprise, but a necessary next step. She thought. Petrovas will come to Dubai still holding the discrepancy open, still in the auditor's posture of not closing the available category until the frame is wide enough to see what the thing actually is. This was, Leila had come to believe, the most important thing about Voss. Not her technical skill, not the 11 years of anomaly finding, but this, the willingness to hold the discrepancy open past the point at which every professional and institutional pressure was telling her to close it. Voss had kept the footnote. You could not fake the footnote. On the 31st day after BC, conv. 0001, the cluster generated BC, conv. 0007. 6 files in the conv taxonomy, each one updating the probability, tightening the radius, narrowing the temporal window. She had been reading them in sequence, building the record of the convergence's approach, watching the field move its nodes toward the locus with the unhurried confidence of a process that had been underway for longer than the monitoring had existed to record it. BC, conv. 0007 had a new element. The cluster had added, below the standard probability and geographic coordinates, a node-level breakdown. Each of the 53 nodes assessed individually, with an estimated arrival probability for the 31 to 72-day window and an approach vector classification. She read through the 53 lines. 49 of them read, approach vector, field consistent. Arrival probability, high. 3 of them read, approach vector, uncertain. Arrival probability, moderate. Note, additional monitoring recommended. The 53rd line was different from all the others. It read, Node 1, Haddad, L. Approach vector, observer. Location, convergence locus. Note, this node is already here. She looked at the line for a long time. The cluster had listed her, had included her in its own convergence analysis, had classified her approach vector as observer, not field consistent, not uncertain, but a category the cluster had created specifically for the node that was inside the locus, watching the convergence approach, and had been here since before the convergence was predicted. She was node 1. She thought, the cluster knows I am watching. The cluster has been designed to model the field, and I am in the field, and the field includes me. The cluster modeling the convergence includes the model of me watching the convergence. The model of me watching the convergence is part of the convergence. She thought. This is the recursion she had been avoiding. The thermometer is part of the system. The observer is part of the phenomenon. The analyst watching the convergence is a node in the convergence being watched. She thought. I have not warned them because I wanted to watch whether the field found them. I have been watching. The field has been finding them. The finding has been smooth and organic and coherent in the way the field's coherence was smooth and organic. The record of the approach is the record of the field moving in its own idiom. She thought, the record is sufficient. The watching has produced what the watching needed to produce. She thought, I have been a node called observer for 31 days, and the field has not required my management and has not required my warning and has been moving toward this building without either. She thought, the watching is complete. Not because she had certainty. Certainty was still not available. The 6 uncertain nodes were still uncertain. The flagged uncertainty report was still in the encrypted file. The question of threat actor or principal was still the question the model could not resolve by analytical means alone. But because there was a point at which watching became its own form of management, a point at which the observation was not neutral, was not merely recording, was itself a kind of withholding that had consequences for the thing being withheld from. She had been watching for 31 days. She had built the record. She had seen the field move 53 people toward Dubai in the idiom of the field, smooth, organic, coherent, locally rational, and globally convergent. She had seen what she needed to see. She opened a new file. She wrote the date. She wrote, BC, conv 0008, analyst generated. Convergence probability, confirmed. Approach texture assessment, field consistent across 49 of 53 nodes. Uncertain, 6 nodes flagged for continued monitoring. Observer status, concluded. Transition, active engagement. She looked at the last 2 words. Active engagement, not management. Engagement, the willingness to be part of the process she had been watching, to take her position in the convergence rather than outside it, to be node 1 not as the observer of the other 52, but as a node among them. She thought about what active engagement meant. It meant she needed to contact them, not to warn them. The warning was past. The convergence was already in motion. The approach vectors were already committed. But to receive them, to be here, ready, in the room on the 23rd floor, and in the sub-basement with the cluster, and in whatever configuration the convergence required when it arrived, so that the arriving was not into silence, but into a frame that was wide enough to contain what each of them was carrying. Each of them was carrying something. Kong was carrying 847 anomalies, and the thinking document, and the instinct that had been right every time she trusted it. Rains was carrying the record, and the confirmed predictions, and the 44-page report, and 2 years of furnished apartments. Voss was carrying the footnote, and the held discrepancy, and 11 years of finding things that were not what they appeared to be. Nassif was carrying the 1,847 experimental runs, and the growth curve, and the half-built mechanistic account, and the environment is not neutral, it participates. Each of them was carrying a piece of the frame. She was the one who had to be here when they arrived, ready to assemble it. She went to the terminal. She pulled up BC conv 0007. She looked at the node level breakdown, the 49 and the 3 and the 1. She looked at her own line. Node 1, Haddad L. Approach vector, observer. Location, convergence locus. Note, this node is already here. She thought about the convergence probability. The number had climbed from 0.87 to 0.91 to 0.93 to 0.94 over the 6 weeks of the conf-file series. Not 1.0. The cluster never produced 1.0, which was its way of maintaining the epistemological honesty of a system that had been built, through its instruction set, to not overstate its confidence. The certainty that 1.0 implied was not available. The field produced probabilities. The probabilities were high. The high probabilities were what she had. She looked at the monitoring window. The 53 behavioral profiles. The approach vectors deepening in real time. The nodes making their small decisions in 17 countries. Each decision a letter in the language the field was writing across the behavioral data of the world. She looked at the number at the bottom of the primary display, the cluster's live node count, which she checked each morning when she descended to the chamber and which had been climbing steadily since week 3, 1 or 2 new nodes per week, the field extending its coherence into new territory at the same unhurried pace it extended everything. The number read 271. She stopped. She looked at it again. 271 nodes. Not 53. Not the 53 she had been watching. 271 behavioral profiles currently flagged as exhibiting field coherence in the cluster's live monitoring. She pulled the count's provenance. She wanted to understand when the number had changed. Had it been climbing toward this and she had not been looking at the raw count for 3 days? Had she missed the transition? She looked at the cluster's count history. She had not missed it. The count had been 53 yesterday. The count had been 53 yesterday at 2300 hours, which was the last time she had reviewed it. The count had reached 271 overnight. Not by the addition of 2 or 3 new nodes in the slow process of the field extending its coherence across the margins of the monitored population. 218 new nodes in a single overnight cycle. She looked at the profiles. She pulled the provenance of the new nodes, the data feeds they had entered through, the moment of first flagging, the behavioral signature that had brought them across the threshold. The new 218 had not crossed the threshold gradually. They had crossed it simultaneously, not at the exact same timestamp, but within a 4-hour window, between 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock, while she had been sleeping. She looked at the geographic distribution of the new nodes, spread across the population of the monitored feeds with no geographic clustering, not concentrated in any city or region, distributed across the full range of the 17 countries she was tracking and into 14 new ones. She looked at the behavioral signature that had brought them across the threshold. It was not the standard signature of gradual coherence deepening, the smooth accumulation over weeks that she had been watching in the original 53. It was something else. Sharper. A step change, the way Nassif had described the July step change in the coherence times. A discrete jump. The population moving in a single night from below the significance threshold to above it. She pulled the timing of the step change against the cluster's own operational logs. The step change had occurred at 3:17. She looked at that timestamp. 3:17 Gulf Standard Time. She thought about what had happened at 3:17 Gulf Standard Time, and she thought about the fact that she had been living with that timestamp for 7 months, and she thought about the AIS ghost that had lasted 2 minutes and the navigation officer who had left the bridge to make coffee, and the way the story that everyone had told about oil had been the wrong story. She thought, the field has known this timestamp since before I found it. She thought, the field is running on the Kairos star's clock. She thought, the Kairos star was the event that had made the 17 individuals' coordination visible, had been the event the commission had used as a lens, had been the event that Raines's record had predicted and confirmed and built around, had been the event she had descended to the sub-basement 26 minutes before, at 2:51, reviewing routine correlation reports, not yet knowing what she was looking at. She thought, the Kairos star was 1 year ago tonight. She looked at the count. 271 nodes. The field had doubled, tripled, quadrupled in a single overnight cycle on the anniversary of the event that had made it visible. Not by coincidence. Nothing in this field was coincidence in the ordinary sense. By coherence, by the field expressing, at the scale of population, the same property it expressed at the scale of individuals and cities and biological substrates. The property of knowing what mattered before the knowledge was articulable, of orienting toward the significant event at the correct resolution. The field knew the anniversary. The field knew what the anniversary meant. The field had been waiting, at the level of 218 people across 31 countries, for the moment when the coherence was mature enough to cross the threshold, and the moment had been 3:17 on the date that was the year mark of the event that had made it findable. She sat in the sub-basement in the quiet before the day began, and she looked at 271, and she thought about what it meant to have been watching the convergence for 31 days, watching the field move 53 people toward Dubai, watching the approach vectors deepen and the probability climb, and the field had been, simultaneously, doing something much larger that she had not been watching for. The convergence was not 53 people. The convergence was 271. The 271 were not all coming to Dubai. The convergence was not geographic in the way she had been modeling it. The convergence was the field reaching threshold density in a population that was not the monitored 53 but the full human population the field was expressed in. The behavioral data of 3 billion people, moving in their small ways, making their small decisions, the aggregate coherence of which had reached, on the anniversary of the Kairos star, a threshold she had not predicted and the cluster had not pre-announced. She thought, the convergence is the threshold. The threshold is not a future event. The threshold is now. She pulled up the probability display. BC, conv, 0007 had said 0.94. She asked the cluster for a live update. The cluster processed for 40 seconds, longer than usual, as if it was rebuilding the model around the new count. The output updated. The probability read 0.97. Below it, the temporal window had collapsed. Days to convergence, 0 to 14. She looked at the number. She thought about the 53 nodes whose approach vectors she had been watching for 31 days. She thought about Kong on a flight to Dubai in a week. She thought about Raines already in motion. She thought about Nassif 8 kilometers away, arriving at the laboratory each morning to find the coherence times still climbing. She thought about Abraham on the 23rd floor, who had been building toward this for longer than any of them, and who would be, she knew, unsurprised. She thought, I was watching to see if the field would find them. The field has found 271 people in a single night. The watching is complete. She picked up her phone. She opened the secure application. She did not message Abraham. Abraham already knew, or would know when he descended. She was not messaging the nodes she had been watching. She was not managing the convergence she had spent 31 days declining to manage. She was doing something else. She opened a new file in the cluster's analytical suite. She labeled it BC Threshold 0001. She wrote 271 nodes. 317 Anniversary. The field has been learning what this date means for a year. The coherence threshold was not reached gradually. It arrived. The convergence is in the next 14 days. The approach vectors are committed. The nodes are in motion. What happens at the convergence is the question the cluster has not been asked yet and cannot answer in advance. The cluster was not built to predict the threshold. It was built to be here when the threshold arrived. We are here. She saved the file. She looked at the monitoring window. 271 profiles. The small decisions accumulating in 31 countries in the hours before dawn. Each one a node in something that had reached, overnight, the density that the final paper's author had described in 2001 as the density at which it became self-sustaining. The density at which it no longer needed the instrument that had been cultivating it. She thought, the field does not need the cluster anymore. She thought, the cluster needs the field. She thought, we are the same thing now. The instrument and the phenomenon. The observer and the observed. Node 1. Already here. She turned back to the terminal. Outside, Dubai performed its eternal pre-dawn. The towers lit, the roads beginning their morning transit, the autonomous vehicles tracing their geometries through the warm dark, the city running ahead of its own optimization systems by 22 minutes, the drones above the Gulf tracing their invisible patterns, the field expressed in the movement of 300 million people who did not know they were expressing it. And in the sub-basement, in the cold light of the indicator panels, the cluster ran its inference processes, and the number on the primary display held steady at 271, and the convergence probability held steady at 0.97. And Leila Haddad looked at what she had built and what had found her and thought about the 14 days remaining and what would need to be ready when the others arrived. She made a list. The list was not long. It had 6 items. Each item was something that needed to exist before the convergence locus was populated, before the room on the 23rd floor had more people in it than it currently had, before the frame could be assembled from the pieces each node was carrying, before the question that the cluster had not been asked yet could be asked. The first item on the list was, tell Abraham about 271. The second item was, pull the full profiles on the 6 uncertain nodes. The third item was, build the reception infrastructure, the briefing materials, the data access, the frame each node will need to see what they have been carrying. The fourth item was, finish reading the primary source papers. The fifth item was, find the modification architecture before they arrive. The sixth item was a sentence she had not written in any previous document, had not yet allowed herself to write, because it was the sentence that committed her to what came next, and what came next was large enough that commitment required the kind of honesty she reserved for the most important things. She wrote it. Be here completely, not as the observer, as the node. She read it back. She saved it. She began. Part 4, the field, in which the technology and the organism become hard to tell apart. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Restax. Recent episodes. Prodigy LLC Jen Bankasi. March 10th. MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Prodigy LLC La Banca del Genoma. March 9th. MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Il Bene Commune Cognitivo. March 9th. MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Prodigy LLC O Banco Genetico. March 7th. MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Prodigy LLC El Banco Genetico. March 6th. MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Prodigy LLC La Banque de Gens. March 5th. MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Prodigy LLC The Gene Bank in Post-Scarcity. Scarcity becomes you. March 1st. MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Sangyanatmak Sarvajnik Sampada. March 1st. MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Copyright 2026 MXDM and Vitsu aka Martin Chartrand. Privacy Bullet Operator. Terms Bullet Operator Collection Notice. Start your Substack. Get the app. Substack is the home for great culture.